So this week you were pointing out to me that what was it? The medieval treasures of Lithuania. It was the Poland-Lithuania Commonwealth crown that got found again, wasn't it? After World War Two.
Yeah, there was a whole bunch of stuff. It was basically a hoard that got hidden
Mm.
during about 80 years ago when the Nazis came,
Yeah,
and they just now they found it in the floor of the church.
yeah,
It had been hiding there, and so yeah. So are we actually live now?
yeah. We're live. We've been
Yeah.
live for a few minutes. That's who's
Yeah.
talking to us.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, great. Well, welcome everyone to our babbling people. Medieval chat. Yeah, so we're planning to start with some news.
Mm.
And there's some interesting stuff that's actually been happening recently, happily. Yeah, so I this article cropped up on medievalist.net. By the way, everyone, if you're not aware of medievalists.net, you absolutely need to go and check out that blog and website. Danielle
Mm.
is amazing. They have amazing podcasts, and it's a really great place to get, get your medieval news.
Mm.
So shout out to them. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of royal regalia that was found in the floor of this church in Lithuania. And that's huge because you probably know this, Philip, that gold usually just gets melted down and reused. They pull
Yeah,
the jewels out, use those, right? Medieval jewelry doesn't usually survive
mm.
unless it gets hidden,
Yeah. We were
um,
just saying about
or
that
unless it
myself
ends up
and the
in a
wife
tomb.
yesterday.
Yeah,
Because
and so it's,
mm,
go on.
what happens in medieval Ireland, once you go outside of the walls of Limerick, Cork, and Dublin, it's very much of an attitude of, well, we can't eat money. So if they collect a certain amount of copper or a certain amount of irons and stuff, instead of using it as coinage, they'll just melt it down and use for day to day farming and stuff. So you're completely right. Medieval people can't eat money, they can't eat a crown, so they'll melt it down and use it for something else. Like,
Well, people forget that there didn't used to be necessarily a sense of tradition,
yeah,
like, oh, well, this crown has been in the family for 300 years. No, no, no. This crown has been in the family for 60 years. Let's make it into something more fashionable,
yeah.
right? That was the medieval idea of fashion was almost more keen than ours is. And
Mm,
so, when a new monarch is preparing to step up, they want to distance themselves from the monarchs who came before,
mm,
maybe. And so then they take, their great grandfather's crown and they go to their local, probably Jewish goldsmith and say, please make this into something more splendid and more contemporary. So it's very exciting
mm,
for us living practitioners of living history when we find these hoards.
yeah.
And for those of us who do an upper class impression, it's even more exciting. Um, but just in general for the history of jewelry and ornamentation, the in Lithuania is pretty monumental. And of course, Lithuania is probably still struggling to define themselves
Yeah,
as a
right now they're
country.
kind of pinned down.
Think right, especially they were part of the Soviet Union,
Mm,
and now they're not, and now they really desperately want to make sure that everyone understands they are a unique cultural and historical phenomenon. So
mm,
this is really big for Lithuanians.
mm.
He's ready
Yeah,
after World War.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah, that's what I said. Yeah.
yeah, they,
Yeah. So that's what for the are looking at the pic. That's what that picture in the bottom left-hand corner. That's
mm.
what they found.
Yeah. It's absolutely extraordinary, and of course, does show the good relationship between Poland and Lithuania as well, especially when they had unified within that period to make the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth. You rarely get that. Like, of course, coming from a country that was completely emerged in with the British, not by choice, with many bloody battles. It's different to find a cohesive Commonwealth merge, especially during the medieval period, because they went from fighting the Teutonic Knights to then suddenly fighting the Golden Hordes, the Mongolians, the various Cumans, all these other nomads that were coming onto their territory to also fight them, to then starting to unify together, both with Poland and Lithuania. And to see this as a good celebration of that unification is actually fantastic to see, especially when we're in very turbulent times
Yeah.
within that part of the world. And as you said there, it's a part of the world that's trying to define its uniqueness and try not to be swallowed up by the modern politics that's going on in both the West and the East. So yeah, it's quite
Yeah.
an interesting time. Like,
And I think a lot of people don't realize that Lithuania was actually one of the last pagan
yeah,
holdouts in Europe.
mm,
You know, they were practicing a local form of pagan religious practice up until the Teutons came
yeah,
in. The Teutonic Knights came in and, had their crusade there. So,
mm,
that's these pieces very clearly fall after that period because they have lots of Christian symbolism. There's
mm, mm,
crosses and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, Poland, the Lithuania and Poland often get overlooked by medievalists. It's like that part of the Europe is
yeah.
just not interesting to people for some reason. But the kind of the cultural and social history there is almost, in my opinion, more complex and more interesting than in the West.
Yeah,
You
I
know,
think I think it's only the last 3 years because of actually gaming media. Weirdly enough, you wouldn't see too much of it in actual Western movies. I don't know a single Western movie that's covered the Teutonic Wars, to cover the unification of Poland and Lithuania, to cover the wars in modern day Czech Republic, the Hussite Wars and stuff, and they're all
right?
magnificently very important. But yet we get loads, and at the same period we get loads and loads and loads of movies to do with the Hundred Years' War, with the Wars of the Roses and stuff, and yet we get very little about what's happening in the eastern side of Europe and obviously into Asia and stuff. So yeah, it's a very good point. But I think, thank God, gaming media, although not as you've pointed out a few times, not always completely accurate, is giving us a slight glimpse of what we could get into. But interestingly enough, obviously, that video game I was showing you about 2 weeks ago, Kingdom Come Deliverance, that looks fantastic, and I think that's coming out in the next 2 months or so.
It did. Yeah, you showed it to me. It definitely, I was impressed, and
Yeah.
I'm pretty jaded when it comes to the
Mm,
depiction of medieval material culture. So for me to say that is, it says something about the quality of the visuals in that
yeah.
game. So yeah, and maybe now that's the one thing I can point to when people ask me, is there you know, some kind of film or video or game that they can look to for visual references?
Yeah.
That's it.
It's completely out of the blue. I think they were inspired. There's a previous game before then, called The Witcher series, and also video games, and it's based on the Polish folklore. That looks exceptionally good, but of course it's fantasy. So I think that's kind of pushed it. I think these kind of setups like Kingdom Come, Witcher 3, it kind of brightens the future a lot. Maybe not in the avenue that we wanted, which was movies, but it gives us a
Right.
little bit of a chance anyway.
Yeah, at least it's something. I've often commented that Game of Thrones, even though it's a fantasy retelling of the wars of the Cousins' War, the Wars of the Roses,
Mm,
their clothing is closer in many ways to 15th century aesthetics
mm, mm.
than most films that I've seen set in the 15th century.
Yeah.
It's frustrating. It's like, oh, that looks definitely more 15th century than the clothes in The King.
I know,
Great.
right?
Fantastic.
God, we could literally rant all day. We should actually do
Yeah. We're
what's it called, a
yeah,
podcast just on movies. Um,
I think we definitely should. We should definitely do a we react to blah. I think that'll be super popular.
it'd just be 2 hours of us bitching. To be honest with
Yeah,
you.
I would. But there's a
Anyway,
lot of schadenfreude people can get from that.
oh,
So
stop. What was it? Medieval kitchens unearthed in Oxford.
yes.
Something that's like very
Well, well,
interesting.
it is for today's theme because we're talking
Yeah.
about food today. So, the thing is that not much medieval infrastructure necessarily survives
Mm,
because just like jewelry, people want to update their homes, they want
yes.
to update their spaces. So when you actually have anything that survives that can tell us about day-to-day life, that's
Mm,
exciting for people who do living history.
yeah.
Um, so, and what's weird about this is it was, I forget which of the colleges it was, but they were actually renovating the kitchen, the
Mm.
modern kitchen, and they found the medieval kitchen underneath and they had no idea it was there.
Whoa.
And yeah, right. So what's really interesting about this, I know it's the picture that's on the bottom right for those who are looking at the PowerPoint. It just looks like a hole in the ground. I know, but archaeologists can look at that hole in the ground and what they can see is that there was an oven,
Mm,
which meant they had internal ovens in their kitchens, right? And not everyone had an oven in the Middle Ages because they're major pieces of technology, and also they can burn your building down. Um, and they had multiple hearths, and they can tell by the structure, because what you see there is actually the hearth, is
Mm,
what that actually depicts, is that it was massive, and that it had a chimney,
mm.
and it's apparently a 14th century structure, and not everyone had chimneys in the 14th century in northern Europe. In fact, most people didn't. So, it's kind of exciting to see that England wasn't quite as backwater as some people on the continent would have you believe. But I just thought it was an interesting bit of news because I found this in December, so
Mm,
this is like really recent,
yeah,
and it pertains directly to our theme today, which is food. So
yeah,
that's
yeah.
why I done.
That's an interesting point that you bring up, that there is a constant belief that England and Ireland are sometimes, at times, backwaters. Um, oh shit, what happened? Are we live again?
Let me see. Hold on a minute.
Yeah, I think we're live again. I think we cut for a second and then we're back on again. I think YouTube
Yeah,
cuts for a second. Give us a quick
it,
second and I will go in and out. Um,
it's still playing on my phone.
yeah, that's
Turtle
okay.
book for the win.
I think some people might have been kicked out there, but we're still going on to go anyway. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, so you
right.
were saying how backwater England
Yeah,
and
there's
Ireland all.
always an idea, especially, I think you might correct me on this one. I think after the Hundred Years' War, there's always this imagery of England and Ireland are slightly not keeping up with the Italian Wars and the Renaissance that's happening in Central Europe.
Yeah,
I think that's, yeah, and it's funny because, okay, so it doesn't have all the great technology that's going on, especially when you have the likes of Leonardo DiCaprio. What was it? I was about to say DiCaprio.
Da Vinci. Is it
Leonardo
Da
da
Vinci?
Vinci. Yeah, I know, right? Going around inventing tanks and stuff that he's been looking and studying with the high site ores and stuff. Yeah,
Right.
tanks are quite ahead of its time. He never actually made a tank, obviously, like, but that whole idea
Exactly.
process that's going on in Italy is definitely way ahead. But at the same time, there is a lot of drips and drabs, as we were saying a few weeks back. You had connections with what was it, Kerry, which is considered the biggest backwater between Britain and Ireland, and yet they themselves had connections all the way to Florence. So I think if they have a good connection with Florence, I think anyone can have a good connection with Florence, and you can see that even with the O'Briens and stuff. Once again, another family that's meant to be the backwater who have connections all
Right.
the way to Rome. So yeah,
Well, I mean,
people need.
London itself is this massive, just like today, back then it was this international city of commerce. London
Mm,
literally had neighborhoods that were the Flemish neighborhood, the Spanish neighborhood, the
mm,
Italian neighborhood. And even though those words, those are the modern words we use for those places, the English didn't necessarily understand that Spain was Castilla and Aragon and, Catalunya. Like they just thought Spain.
mm,
So there were there was so much interaction and so much cultural exchange happening,
mm.
even in backwater Tudor England, or end game Plantagenet England.
We got our first
Yeah.
question coming up there. What was the most popular food in medieval England, Ireland, France, and the Low Countries?
Oh
Uh,
God. Okay, so we will definitely get to that when we
mm,
get to our food section.
yeah,
Good,
yeah.
good
We'll
question.
just wrap this bit up here
Yeah.
on, what was it? Oh yeah, the County of Flanders.
Yeah.
Um,
So
yeah,
so
that was
medieval
interesting.
Bruges. Did you read the article?
Yeah, I
It's
read
pretty
it all right. A few good old Latin words inside there, but it was quite interesting that it shows the connection of trade route. I think
Yeah.
what was it? The County of Flanders and the Duchy counties. Sorry, the Dutch counties are always another one that always gets ignored and stuff. Obviously, it's modern day Netherlands and what was it? The
Belgium.
sorry.
Belgium.
Belgium, yeah,
Belgium.
Belgium
Belgium.
and
Yeah.
Netherlands area, and they always get slightly ignored as well. And they're one of the most vital areas for trade and stuff. And I think this research does kind of, from my perspective as a historian, really nails the head there that you need to keep watching that area, especially with the trade and movement that's going on there, because even today, anytime Europe gets dragged into any problems, that area gets dragged in, and that actually pulls in Britain and Ireland into the problem as well.
Everyone. It's like
Because
this focus of violence.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it's because it's so important in trade. The trade in that area is, even right now, is so vitally important.
Yeah, people don't realize that that part of the world, Rotterdam and those major seaports are
Mm,
still Zeebrugge are still a heart of international global trade for
yeah.
Europe. I mean, so many, that's where so many ships dock. But so for those who aren't tracking, this article I found in Bruges, they were excavating and they found this latrine.
Mm,
I love it. Latrines, for us historians, latrines are the best
mm, mm, mm.
because you find so many great clues in them.
Yeah.
And they excavated this latrine in what was the Spanish settlement. So it was this amazing house that was built specifically for the Castilian merchant representation there in Bruges.
Mm,
And this latrine dates to the 15th century. And they analyzed some of the feces and they found schistosoma eggs.
mm,
Schistosomiasis is a sub Saharan African parasitic disease. It has never been found in Europe at this date.
mm,
To contract schistosomiasis, which by the way is a horribly debilitating disease, you have to come in contact with infected water, and it has to come in contact with your skin because the larvae penetrate your skin and get into your bloodstream. So you can't contract it through casual passing by someone who has it. You have to come in contact with the thing itself, which means that people in Bruges had to have been to sub-Saharan Africa. Someone in Bruges
mm.
was absolutely in sub-Saharan Africa
Yeah.
in the 15th century. And it could be someone from sub-Saharan Africa. It could be someone a person of not white complexion
Mm,
who came up on the trade ships and was living and working in Bruges in the 15th century, or it could have been a merchant from Bruges who went all the way down there. But yeah, like you said, the connections.
mm.
This once again opens our eyes to the way in which medieval Europe was actually not isolated from the
Yeah.
rest of the world.
Oh, well, it's also highlighting the fact that we're going into the late medieval and Renaissance now, and it, it's funny because people just expect Africa to suddenly appear, and yet it's a slow development as we slowly go into the trade routes down the African pattern stuff, and this is solid proof that you do have traders now at this point going into late medieval period starting to go into more deeper into Africa and stuff, and building up those trade routes and stuff as they also start tearing into America and stuff. And I think anybody who has basic common sense of medieval history will realize the development that's going on and should be able to put two and two together. Um,
You would hope.
hmm.
So yeah, with that in mind, I thought that would be a great tasty segue into our topic of medieval food because
Oh, definitely, definitely.
parasites and feces makes me want to eat,
Yeah,
obviously.
not everyone, but yeah.
No, it really doesn't.
Mm,
Okay. So yeah, let's I thought we could start with some debunking of some of these common food myths that you hear about medieval food.
mm,
And I think the first one I always get from people or that I read and that makes me cringe, especially when I read some casual food blogger who's trying to expand into medieval food. And nearly always the first thing they say is, well, medieval food was covered in these strong sauces with all these spices
mm.
because meat was rancid. People ate rotten meat and they had
Oh,
to cover the flavor. Have
yeah.
you heard that one?
I've heard a good few ones like that, especially. Do you ever hear these days they have the saying white people food, which is food that's very bland, it's very
And
unseasoned.
yeah,
But the problem is that when you're dealing with especially migration, so this kind of idea of white people food comes with the migration from Europe to the wider world, where the people who
right.
are going into the wider world, and I don't want to sound offensive to anybody that has immigrated over to America, immigrated over to Australia and stuff, but there's a reason why a lot of ancestors and stuff would have immigrated, and that's for new opportunities that they didn't get in their main country. So, if you, for example, a good example of that would be the Irish that immigrated over to America. A lot of them were lacking the education that they needed within Ireland. Um, that my family, for example, we I suppose they would have
Right.
called it privilege or something. My family, so even my father, he's very very good at cooking. The majority of the food that we researched, what was it, yesterday and the day before, my dad can actually cook all that food. You know, my mom and dad can cook that food perfectly. And you ask them, okay, who taught you how to cook? They say, oh, well, my parents taught me to cook, and their parents would have taught them. However, a good chunk of people that would have immigrated over, a lot of the, especially when you're dealing with famine and war, their parents would have not been around to educate them with the correct way of seasoning, how to unbland the food. So when they immigrated over to the likes of America or Australia, they're going over there trying to quickly adapt to what's going on with little to no education. And that's one
Right.
of the main problems compared to, lucky enough, other immigrants that came over who were much more educated when it came down to food. Now, you could argue, well, they weren't educated in different areas, but when it came down to food, it appears that different immigrants that went into the likes of Australia and America were more educated on how to season food, how to make food
Right.
less bland.
Well, even even still though, there's this what most people don't realize is there's a big cultural break in Europe between the medieval palate and what we call the nouvelle cuisine, the
Yeah.
sort of the modern palate. And
Mm.
that's actually that's all brought about the reason that
Yeah.
even flavorful European food these days doesn't have all these spices that
Yeah.
medieval food does. And it comes down to um, Louis the XIV.
Mm.
At the end of Louis the XIV's life, he became very ascetic
Yeah.
because he realized the fires of hell were coming for him, and so he started living this really simple life. And
Mm.
he ordered his cooks to stop preparing fancy, flavorful food and to start preparing all this really basic stuff.
Mm.
And he literally cut the spices from his table. And so, of course, what happens when Versailles does something in the end of the 17th century?
Mm.
Every other court did the same thing. And so that is actually the start of the what I'm going to call the boringification of Western food.
Yeah.
That's why we no longer have all these flavorful sauces with cloves and cinnamon and mace in them because Louis the XIV said, I don't want to go to hell, so I need to eat simply. And everyone else said, well, we want to be like the French court.
Yeah.
And then then the French Revolution happens, and all of these chefs from France who are trained
Mm.
in La Nouvelle Cuisine, flee France because they don't want to see the guillotine. And so that kind of finishes off the what was medieval cuisine, what came before basically.
Mm.
So I would still say that even compared to your average 15th century recipe, high-end recipe, your average high-end dish these days is pretty boring in terms of flavor
Yeah,
profile.
that's very true. But I also trip over myself as well. So where I'm saying that a lot of people who immigrated to America would have been uneducated when it comes down to making food, that's not always the case. We can actually find foods that kind of disappear in Europe that were still found, that actually are today still found in America. And as I was using the example earlier
True.
about Irish immigrants that immigrated over to America, during
Right?
the 1850s immigration, which is the potato famine, which if you do a
Potato
bit of
famine, yeah.
research, you can go down a very dark rabbit, which we'll not go into today. What was it? Because so many Irish families were lost during that period, there's certain foods, for example, that a lot of Irish people deny today is actually Irish, but it really is, which is corned beef cabbage, which is
Oh God,
lost
that's a
in Ireland.
staple in my house.
Yeah, it's actually lost in Ireland. So it was, you can find records going way back to the early medieval period of cabbage being introduced to Ireland and then them
And
being able to
and
produce.
corned beef, of course, is very medieval with all the
Yeah,
spices and whatnot that go into it. That's a good point.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
interesting. So you don't have that in Ireland
it
anymore.
disappeared in Ireland. During the famine, it actually
Wow.
disappeared. There were so many
Wow.
families that went missing. Oh, and I could actually talk all day about the amount of medieval stuff that just disappears in Ireland, but stays in America. So literally just immigrates over to America, stays in America. And then when a lot of Irish Americans are going, oh, I'm Irish American, I have A, B, and C. Irish people in Ireland are like, I don't have that. Clearly, you're not Irish. It's so mad. And one of which is certain foods that Irish Americans make that turn around and say, oh, well, that's Irish. Clearly, you guys would make it. Ireland's like, no, we don't make that at all. It just completely disappears. one of which is corned beef, because they didn't have those food groups anymore. They were mostly stuck down to the very stripped down basics of potatoes or whatever they
Wow.
could scavenge. Like my grandmother, during the famine, her family survived just on nettle stew. So imagine how much
Oh, oh,
information was
oh
lost.
God. Oh my
Yeah,
God. Nettle stew. Jesus.
yeah, that's
So
what
for
they
those who
survived.
don't know, corned beef is it's a way of preserving beef
Mm,
so that you can hold it for a long time. And it's a kind of a pickling process. Not it's not a hard pickle, like it doesn't taste like vinegar, but it does have a
mm,
tang. And there's a lot of spices that go into it that retard bacterial growth. And it's kind of stored in this brine. And then when you want to use it, usually it's made into a stew, which kind of cooks out the excess salt and that sort of thing. And so, yeah, you're right. In America, corned beef and cabbage, man, that was a staple in my
yeah.
house growing up.
There's actually a story as well. So a lot of Irish Americans that have gotten into medieval history in Ireland now, they would argue it goes all the way back to the early medieval period, which is actually an easy argument to make because the Romans
Yeah.
introduced cabbage, and of course we had beef as well. And there
Yeah.
is one particular tale that talks about a certain beef food that's produced that's very similar to what was it, corned beef cabbage, which
Mm.
is the tale of, sorry, the vision of Con Glennon, which is, it's such a funny story, that one. And it's absolutely amazing because most stories are passed down only give us like a little keyhole into
Right.
the medieval
Little
world.
tiny window. Yeah, right.
Rachel, if you haven't read this, I have to send this on to you. It's like kicking in the door to the medieval world. Not only do
Oh,
we
yeah,
have
please do.
not only do we have one version that gives an insane amount of detail of the medieval world, we have two versions. So there's one written by the rival group, the Nael up in the north,
Mm.
and then there's the second one that's actually written where I live down in Cork. That's complete opposite and completely says, so the two rival groups. So whatever the Nael said, the Cork side, my side, will turn be like that never happened. They are this, they are that, da da da. Which to get two different versions, like the news of CNN, the news of Fox News that day, and have that preserved for almost two, what was it, 1,500 years is absolutely magnificent, but also with high details. Now, the reason why I highlight this today, as we'll talk down the road, is because it gives so many details of the different. Because the reason why this guy has a vision is that he has a vision of him. He's put into prison, by the way. He's a member of the Enail. He goes down to Cork because the king in Munster's sick, so he has to go and treat him. And
Right.
he ends up getting locked up, and they're threatening to crucify him. The men in Cork, because he ends up insulting them. The men in Cork are like, "Okay, you're going to get executed. We'll crucify you." So while he's locked up in
As
jail,
one does.
yes, it escalates completely out of hand. But anyway, while he's locked up, what was it called? He ends up he's very very hungry, and he has a vision. And he in this vision he gives a real proper crazy detail into all these different foods of the early medieval period. So it's absolutely magnificent. I'll make sure to
Do you happen to have any of that text on hand to just read a little bit out
um,
for the
the
stream?
wife sent it
It
on
would
to me. I don't have it right now on me, but I could easily send it onto the chat later and stuff as we're chatting away and stuff. But it is absolutely magnificent. I could actually send the name. So if anybody wants to read it, I could actually send the name into chat now, as we're slowly going on to the next debunking part. Just a
Yeah,
second.
so while you're doing that, I'll just go to the chat. A couple of comments. Aussie here. Corned beef has been the cornerstone of my diet since childhood.
Mm, good medieval
Let's
food there.
see. Yeah. Another comment from Mirkala. The preservation of older European traditions in the US happens across a lot of groups. Norwegian Americans still eat lutefisk,
Mm,
and the Norwegians have understandably gotten rid of it. But you know, my Swedish friends still eat lutefisk. In fact, that nasty stuff is part of the pre-wedding rituals at the hen party and the bachelor party. You have to
mm.
prove you can successfully open a can of that nasty fish. Ugh.
Is it that bad?
Anyway, it's horrible. Oh my God, it is. You have no idea. And if you don't open the can properly, it will explode. So it's pretty horrible.
What? I am unaware. I'm
Yeah.
completely unaware of all this.
Lutefisk. Oh, lutefisk. Oh my God. You need to get to some living history events in Sweden, and then you're gonna have a whole new horizon open up from you.
Oh, I definitely want to try
Um,
it out now, just for the fun of it. Like,
oh my God, lutefisk. Oh, the smell alone. And you have to open it outside. You are
mm.
not allowed to open these things in a house in Sweden. You have to go outside.
Do you think it was
Unless
brought over to Ireland in the early medieval period from
No, I
Scandinavian
absolutely. I
traders?
mean, it's basically it's herring that's been, or I think it's herring. It's a fish. It's a
Mm,
North Sea, Baltic Sea fish that is, salted and preserved, and it's kind of allowed to rot as a form of fermentation.
mm,
And I'm absolutely confident that it would have been in Norse Ireland, right, in
yeah.
the first millennium Ireland. There's no way it couldn't have been.
Mm, mm, mm.
Um,
Thought it
in
would
fact,
be.
I'm confident if you start digging deeply enough, probably you'll find some chronicler commenting on the stinky fish that these foreigners have brought with them or
Mm.
something like that.
So yeah, that's the name of it there. So if anybody wants to look that up, there are two versions of that, and it covers food into amazing detail and stuff. That like the whole thing, even the way that they talk about cooking for the king and stuff. Because later on, when your man gets freed from prison and he ends up cooking for the king of Munster, to try to because the story starts off with him being poisoned. The Enale and the King of Munster are having an argument, and he sends the King of the Enale sends a poison apple over to the King of Munster. He eats it, gets poisoned, and then the Enale have to send one of their educated monastic. It's a monk who gets sent over. To go and cure him, and while he's there, the monk ends up complaining about the food because the food is horrible. So the men of Cork end up locking him up, and they actually threaten to crucify him, which you
As
know
one does.
yeah,
It's a normal reaction to complaints about one's food. I mean,
well, what was it? My wife yesterday, we were talking about it, and she was like, "That's your father, by the way. If somebody came into the house and criticized my father's food, he'd probably crucify them." Like,
yeah, right.
so
So we've got a couple of comments.
mm,
Bacon and cabbage is the modern Irish version of corned beef cabbage.
yes, it is.
Um,
Uh,
And then have the Floods family done anything in the medieval era? Asking for my little cousin. We're going to stick to food today, I think.
the Floods. I'm not sure.
Um,
The Floods family. Are the Floods family Irish? And what part of Ireland are the Floods family from? I'd have to ask Michael about if the Floods family are Irish. I'd have to ask Michael about that in clans and dynasties. So we'll get back to that later on.
then Caravaggio comments that we eat fermented anchovy sauce, which is Worcestershire sauce, and he is
Mm,
right about that.
yeah.
But in Worcestershire sauce, the percentage of anchovies to other things is reasonable so that it doesn't smack you in the nose and make you want to vomit, right? I
Mm,
love Worcestershire sauce, and I make it myself from scratch using fermented anchovies. But lutefisk is a whole new level of olfactory pain.
mm,
Um, yeah, so back to the debunking food myths thing. So this idea that medieval people ate putrid meat
mm.
after we just talked about putrid fish.
Uh,
They did not eat putrid meat that would make you sick, and they did not use spices to cover up putrid flavors. And we actually
well,
know that because there's actually a chronicler that talks about putrid food at court in the
mm,
12th century, and how it's not good.
yeah.
So if you have medieval people complaining when things are rancid,
Mm,
that means that isn't what they're used to eating,
yeah.
right? So this guy Peter of Blois. Law visited the English court. Back to talking about the English court, and he talks about that there's no order at the court, no plan, no moderation. They don't exercise. They don't. Well, he really complains,
Mm,
but he talks about how the wine is spoiled either by being sour or moldy, thick, greasy, rancid, tasting of pitch and vapid. So when you're complaining about things that have actually spoiled,
mm,
um, because that's not good. That kind of tells you that, yeah, medieval people weren't eating rotten food that wasn't supposed to be rotten.
mm,
There's
mm.
a difference between something that's naturally fermented and good for you and something that's growing putrid toxic mold and will kill you, right?
Yeah, that's definitely
So yeah,
true.
medieval food was not covered in spices, people, and rich sauces just because the meat was spoiled. In fact, as we just talked about with the corned beef, there were lots of ways to preserve
There
food
were.
and prevent it from spoiling,
Obviously,
right?
most famously in Ireland is the what's it called? The bog butter, putting the butter on the ground and
Oh
stuff.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
that's
people probably don't know about that, that they actually find medieval crocks, ceramic crocks of and wooden crocks of butter in the bogs that have just gotten forgotten.
yeah,
Um, I remember reading about one that was excavated that was dated to the 15th century, and the butter was apparently still okay.
yeah.
So,
It was what's it called? Yuki was telling me yesterday. It is John Kerry. Is it John Kerry? It is anyway one of the archaeologists. Anyway, they found one of the bog butters, and he had a old taste of it, and he says absolutely disgusting. It's the worst taste he's ever had, which kind of fits in because I was looking at other literature yesterday and stuff, and it was saying that more of the upper classes would have more fresh butter, butter that's just oh, what's the correct word for that one? I cannot remember.
freshly churned.
Churned, that's the key word, churned.
Yeah.
The more of the higher noble classes would have freshly churned, and then we have others that would say it's so the more of the pecking order, the more you would have had the bog butter and stuff, and the higher up, so the level of the kings and stuff would have had it freshly done there and then for them. Um, so yeah, and that the bog butter is not as tasty as the freshly churned one.
Right, by I guess by good I meant not will not kill you from bacterial infection. You won't get
Yeah.
botulism from it. But yeah, it's funny that most people don't realize that even in today's world, there are actually two basic kinds of butter.
Mm,
What they call sweet cream, which is uncultured butter, and then there's cultured butter, which where the cream is actually cultured and then it's soured so that it actually lasts longer. And so the sweet cream butter actually has a lightly sweet taste, whereas the sour butter very clearly has a sour taste. And I know
mm,
friends who have never had cultured butter, when they have it for the first time, they hate it.
mm, mm, mm.
So I don't know. Maybe the bog butter is just like super cultured. I don't
Could
know.
be. Definitely probably wasn't part of his normal palate. I'd have to give it a go because I come from a very butter family as well, butter and salt. My
Right.
grandfather, yeah, he passed away early because he had too much salt. He used to, oh, and it was crazy. I remember as a child, he used to get the bread, then he used to get the ham, and then he used to cover it in salt and then give it to me. And now I'm looking back going, oh, I wonder why he passed away early.
Well,
It's
I
good
mean,
times though.
I'm not going to get into the debate about how saturated fat isn't actually bad for you, but that's a discussion for a different time.
Very
Um,
true.
I think we should move on.
Mm,
Uh, let's talk about how we know what we know, because you know I've often talked about the triangle, the triumvirate, the trinity of medieval living history knowledge, and that's archaeological, documentary, and iconographic. And the same thing applies for food.
mm,
So, in Europe, in mainland Europe, we have so many cookbooks that have survived from very far back, including ancient Rome.
mm,
So we have a lot of cookbooks. We have, and that's some pictures of some that you can actually go and purchase if you like, dear
mm.
viewers. We have uh, we have also health manuals that are written, composed especially usually by monks
Mm,
or by nuns like Hildegard von Bingen. There are uh, descriptions by people of feasts, and of course, lots of archaeology. We have pots in which food remnants are still found, and when you analyze the pot shards, you can see what kind of food was stored in it. And in some cases, we actually just have archaeological finds. So, like for instance, um, I guess I included it later. I thought I included it here under medieval food sources. They actually found a 15th century shipwreck. Where did that shipwreck go? We actually found a 15th century shipwreck in, oh, here it is. We
oh,
actually found a medieval shipwreck off the coast of Sweden
mm,
that sank in 1495, and it was laden. It was this gentleman was going to go and try to claim the crown. He did, by the
mm,
way, 2 years later, but he had this ship laden with wealth because he wanted to show the Swedes who would elect him that he was worthy of being king. I think he was going to bribe them, actually. But anyway, the ship sank while he was not on it, thankfully, and caught on fire and sank. And they excavated it, and because of the anaerobic conditions in the mud, in the muck, the spices are actually perfectly preserved. The saffron still smells like saffron. The pepper still smells like pepper. So what you're looking at here are, actually medieval foodstuffs that you could possibly still use, in cooking to this day. And what you have here in the bottom right hand corner is actually round peppercorns and then long pepper on the right hand side there. Anyway, so what do we have? What do we have in Ireland? For sources.
The two main sources before you even get out the front door is definitely start off with, as always, the Bible of all this, which is a guide to early Irish law. That's definitely a good place to start. It's always a good place to start when it comes down to it. The reason for it, and I think somebody has that, Ryan might have posted at some stage about status and stuff, and you can go through the stats here, going from what nobles were allowed to eat all the way down to the bottom. It also covers the laws of what hostages could eat, and also children who were put up for fosterage. So if you fostered a child or you took a hostage in, what were they allowed to
Right.
eat or not eat? One of the most interesting things, once again, is butter. Straight away, if you were of the higher class, of course, if you were fostered into any family, you had to have good fresh butter. But interesting enough, at the lower classes, if you were fostered or taken hostage, do not expect to be taking any butter. The people who were keeping you in their home were not expected to give you any form of butter whatsoever, which is quite interesting in itself. And it's even the same with the type of ingredients to put into porridge. If you look at the laws cover how your porridge should be made in the morning. Obviously, the high nobility had the best, not only the best of porridge, but also the beautiful honeys and different other ingredients that were put on top. All those little juicy bits. When the poor children, not only the children at the bottom, if they were ever fostered into a different family or taken hostage, they were just given terrible food, like literally just the worst porridge and nothing juicy and tasty on top. Those poor little
Oh,
children. Oh yeah, you can imagine being
oh,
the little child in the corner and you see all the noble children getting their nice honey and there they are
oh,
just going,
Jesus.
but I want some too, with no understanding of how medieval world works, just as lost
Of
as
how
we
the
are today.
haiarchy works. Yeah.
Yeah, poor child. You can
It's
imagine.
funny so basically that's like it's not really a sumptuary law because it's not regulating excess per se,
Mm,
but it is a sort of early sumptuary law. And actually, we get the same thing in various parts of Europe.
mm,
Not so much in the early medieval period because apparently they don't have enough to excess to have to regulate the excess.
mm,
But starting in Italy in the 14th century or 13th century, you start seeing laws regulating how much people are allowed to spend on food
mm,
for feasts, wedding feasts, for that sort of thing, and that kind of continues, and that starts creeping throughout Europe
mm.
as the 15th century moves on, and then by 16th century, but in Tudor England, apparently they passed some super stringent laws regulating the amount that you were allowed to spend on feasts because the nobility were just losing their minds trying to outdo each other in excess. So yeah, these laws can be a really interesting another way, like you say, to see what people had,
Mm.
because if they didn't have it, there wouldn't need to be a law against it.
Aye. I'll just cover what Ryan says in a bit because myself, the two of us were actually talking about that yesterday because that word
Oh,
curry, actually, yeah, that was the one that confused me. I had to ask you about that yesterday. We'll cover that in
form
just
of
a
courage. Yeah, that
second.
is. Well,
Uh,
yeah, because that's one of the sources. So that
yeah, it is. Ryan's bang on track there with that one. I just want to cover this book quickly, Ryan, and I'll get back to you there. The next one actually is written by the same author of Early Irish Law, and that's Fergus Kelly's second book, which is on early Irish farming. Of course, because it's farming, you'll get way more detail when it comes down to the food that they can both eat and grow on the territories and stuff. So they're two very, very important books, even before you start. Now, as we enter
right,
into the Golden Age of Ireland, you have the saints' lives. Now, you could argue if they're accurate or not accurate, but because they're written in those periods, they give you a good idea of the foods they would have eaten, let's say in the 12th century
right,
or the 16th century. Depending on the period that source is written, even if it's a lie about the Golden Age of Ireland, it still gives us a good idea of what people are eating at the time, because these are supposed to be depicting the day to day life of the clergy. So, for example, if
Right.
we were talking about the vision tale I was saying earlier, which I left in the comment
We
section, if
should
you can scroll and find
we
my
should
comment somewhere,
we should really just call that a hallucination. It is not a
yeah,
vision, it's a hallucination.
it's
That man was starving.
that man's a saint and he's seen a vision, and that's that. How dare you question my
I
sins?
I know I'm Catholic. I'm going to hell. It's okay.
I've got the wife in the background roaring, "He's not a saint, he's a monk." What was going to say again? It still gives us a really good detail of the foods that people are eating at the time. So definitely check out. So as we go from the early medieval period into the high Middle Ages and then into late medieval periods, even tales that are not written specifically in the early medieval period, they still give us a good idea of this, food that people ate at that time. So definitely look into the saints' lives, and then of course, as we were saying earlier, look at the foods that people would have made at that time, and then look at the culture food that people would make later on. So obviously a good example of that is the corned beef cabbage. Have a look at that, see if there's roots, take the step back in time and see if there's roots going all the way back into the medieval period. And there may have been. And it's a good argument to take if people made corned beef cabbage in the medieval period.
Well, and sometimes, especially with something like corned beef, sometimes you can be lucky enough to actually find a chunk of it in some in some excavation
Mm,
or in a bog.
that's it.
I recall reading about some meat that was actually found in a bog, and this, I wish I'd thought about this before now and dug further into it. It's been a couple of years,
Mm,
but I do definitely recall reading about things like meat, not just bog butter, but meat and other things that have been found in bogs.
mm,
God knows how it ended up there,
yeah.
but and then when you analyze it, when you do a say chromatographic analysis or something like that, then you can see what the components are, what sort of spices were used, what sort of chemical compounds are present. And oftentimes like you say, you find these parallels between certain dishes that are kind of like an echo of their medieval ancestor.
Mm, 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 mm. Oh,
So yeah, so
definitely.
that brings us to the form of curry, right?
Yeah, Ryan
I,
was saying there. You're the one who explained this to me yesterday. Because
yeah.
I was completely confused because I thought it was curry that we were eating this day and age. So I was like, surely they didn't have, what was it,
They
French
did
fries and
not.
curry back then.
No. No, so form of curry, for those who don't know, is kind of it's the modern name for a series of manuscripts that are basically a copy of the same manuscript, and it's most commonly the one that most people actually know is the scroll version that was associated with Richard the Second's court. I thought I had a picture here of the scroll because here, that's from a form of curry. Um, and it's it's known as form of curry because it's written in this French English, this Anglo French,
Mm,
and so a lot of the words are a combination of or an Anglicization of the French because it's actually from a French manuscript. The collection is of French recipes,
mm,
and in the introduction of the Richard II version, it talks about a forma of curry, which is from the French cuillery, which is cookery. So it's not curry like we know curry. In fact, as I told you, curry we think is actually modern word curry is actually the Tamil word for sauce. And so that's why an Indian dish that has a lot of sauce is called a curry.
mm.
Yeah, it's parallel development. They've got nothing to do with each other. Um, but the this cookbook, and I think this ties it in probably with Ireland.
Mm.
Form of curry is the form that most people know. The scroll version was is attributed to the cooking masters of Richard II, which is actually in the introduction of that version of the manuscript.
Mm.
And as I understand it, there are lots of connections between Richard II's court and Ireland, right?
Yes, because Richard II had his invasion of Ireland from, I'm going to be corrected here, it is from 1394 up to 1399 is the invasions and the campaigns of Richard II in Ireland. So he literally brought the Hundred Years' War that was being fought in France and up in Scotland at the time. He brought that over to Ireland now. So Ireland and Leinster and up around the what was it, the Carlow area, Carlow Castle, that whole area now has
Right.
become the front line in the Hundred Years' War. And as part of that, Richard II is now going between Waterford and Dublin, and he even holds big Christmas feasts in Dublin. Um,
Aha. Okay.
yeah,
There it is. There's the food connection.
yeah.
So what did you actually find the form of curry actually referenced for food in, say, Dublin and
I
in
didn't
within the
find
Pale?
that per se. I'm just aware
Right,
of its existence. So I
right,
didn't actually get to read the source itself, but I am aware of it.
right. Yeah. So yeah, form of curry, for those who don't know, has hundreds of recipes in it. It is an amazing source for upper end of 14th and 15th century cuisine in France, and as the nobility were enjoying it in England, and anyone else, those of the middling sort who are trying to aspire to greater things. Yeah, Form of Curry is a pretty fun cookbook to work with. I've actually redacted several of the recipes, and I have a video on making Alois de mutton, which is lamb rolls, lamb meat rolls filled with this delicious filling of marrow, bone marrow, and boiled egg and herbs. And then you roll it in the meat and then you roast it. Oh, so good. Dip it in sauce. Yummy, yummy. I probably should have eaten breakfast before this. Anyway,
Yeah, same.
okay, let me see. Poor Richard II didn't have a great time in Wicklow, did he? Nope, nope, he
No,
did
he did
not.
not.
Nope.
Got nicely
Time for
dissected.
Richard II. Richard II, in my opinion, is actually kind of this tragic historic figure
Yeah.
because he's aspiring to be like this great erudite prince, and yet he's a real asshole.
Yeah, he's a
Like
funny
he's
character.
he's cruel.
Yeah.
And you know, it's what, but ironically, I think what gets him in the end is not actually his cruelty to, say, the peasants and other people. It's, you know, the fact that he's effeminate and doesn't line up with his family's ideas of a warrior king, right?
Yeah.
So his uncle just kind of steps in and takes care of that. But
Yeah.
you know,
I
in
bet
terms of
you.
arts, he was great for the arts. I mean,
Mm,
Chaucer flourished under him, artists flourished under him.
mm,
But yeah.
yeah.
Okay, onward with food.
Before
Yeah,
Richard
so there are
starts
lots
that.
of yeah. So to sum it up, there are lots of great sources, even in Ireland, where sadly no cookbooks have survived. But we have hope that maybe someday we will find something in continental European library, some medieval Irish manuscript that maybe can provide us with more documentary evidence. That would
Mm.
be really
Oh
wonderful.
yeah, that'd be magnificent.
Okay, so let's talk about equipment and facilities for food, because what most people don't think about unless they actually cook is that you can only cook things that for which you have the right equipment and facilities. Like there's a lot of modern dishes that you can't do in a medieval kitchen because
Mm.
they couldn't control fire that closely, they couldn't control temperature that closely, they didn't have the physical equipment. So, you know, in mainland Europe, we have in noble houses, you've got these massive kitchens where you have
Mm.
multiple rooms devoted to very specific functions. You had a pastry making room, you had a sauce making area. You know, there were certain kitchens. The Urbino, the Duke of Urbino in the 15th century, his kitchen had like 8 hearths,
Mm.
and you know, and that's how they cooked. They cooked over a hearth. There were no stoves like we understand it. So as you can see, this gentleman here cooking with these 3 pots over this scary looking fire,
Mm.
like that's a noble kitchen right there. That's not a peasant cooking, everyone. That's how those giant pots.
Mm.
Those were probably iron, by the way, probably metal pots, not pottery pots of that size. Um, you know, you've got metal pots, you have pottery pots. You can control the heat, as you see in that middle picture. There were sophisticated leverage devices that could ratchet the cauldron up or down to get it. That's how you regulated the heat, was less controlling the fire and more
Mm.
controlling proximity to the fire.
Should the PowerPoint
Yes,
be on the next one, or is it supposed to keep on the books? Oh yeah, there we go.
I think there might be a lag, unfortunately.
Oh yeah, the lag. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
causing it.
Yeah, I
That's
think
grand.
I think I think there's a lag, yeah. And not everyone had ovens.
Mm.
You know, we take for granted in the West anyway. God knows, not in Asia, you don't take for granted that you have an oven. But in the West, we take for granted that houses have ovens. But
Mm.
almost no one had an oven in their home.
Yes.
Uh, you know, the nobility did. They always had ovens.
Yeah,
Their
because
own.
you,
But
you can see that straight away over in Barati Castle. If we look at Barati Castle itself, it's got this nice, beautiful heats and ovens and all that kind of stuff. And then if you go over to where the crannogs and stuff are, the roundhouses and stuff, you've got people cooking in very old-fashioned bronze styles and stuff. So even techniques from the Bronze Age are still being used around where I'm from, up around Barati Castle and stuff. So you can see people having very old techniques all the way up to the modern techniques of the late medieval period inside those great halls within the keep of the castle. So that's definitely true. Like, and it even goes into the status and stuff of the person. Like from what I've seen in Bharati.
right, right, yeah, it's it's I don't know about Ireland, but in most of Northern Europe and even some parts of Southern Europe, you didn't even have a chimney or
Mm.
a hearth
Yeah.
fireplace. You actually had your fireplace was in the center of the hall, and there was a hole in your ceiling,
Yeah.
and that's how you cooked. And the problem with that is that the smoke does not just perfectly funnel up towards that hole. It fills the entire space and eventually kind of goes out. But what that means is that your average person was living in pretty smoky conditions, which might is probably more likely to have contributed to a shorter lifespan for people than anything else. But yeah, it's hard for us to imagine just kind of existing in this constantly smoky environment.
Because
Um,
I,
the reality is that not everyone had chimneys, and
mm,
most people didn't get chimneys in their homes until the 17th century.
yeah,
I'm assuming that's probably the same in Ireland.
yeah, it's around that period that we start to get all those modern techniques into the houses and stuff. Because even up
Right?
to it's a kind of a gradual thing, but it doesn't really start to modernize. Well, start taking on more English styles until around the after the around the 17th century, going into the 18th century, and even on top of that, you still have patchworks that are developing at different speeds and stuff, and it depends on the culture developments, because there's a lot of people that do not feel the need. Myself and my wife were talking about this. They don't feel the need to develop and change because they're adapted to that area of Ireland, and they work perfectly fine. And of course, when you remove their styles of techniques and stuff, of the way they build a house and stuff, sometimes the Atlantic wind comes in and it's far worse than what it will be under, in Dublin, where they have more protection from the walls and stuff. So
Right.
sometimes change is not good. It really does depend on the people of that area and stuff, and how they've developed
Right.
and changed.
But yeah, it's I a lot of modern people don't view it this way, but the technology that is useful in one place is not necessarily useful in another climate at all.
Mm.
So yeah. So here I'm showing a picture of this is a restored medieval kitchen in Verrucole Castle, which is in Tuscany. And this is the kind of kitchen. Now, granted, I'm pretty certain those walls need to be plastered, so they haven't
Mm.
completely restored it. But anyway, you can see that this is what people are generally working with. Now, that being said, this one has a wooden countertop on a trestle tables. I do know that most medieval kitchens throughout continental Europe had massive stone counters, and they actually had sinks. And the sinks would actually drain into a cesspit. So this kind of ties in with another myth that medieval people were dirty and that they ate dirty and that they lived dirty, and none of that is true. Most of the sources that talk about these cookbooks often talk about keeping your space clean. They talk about how to scrub your space, how to clean your equipment. They're very concerned about cleanliness, even if they don't understand the microbial function or action that's happening when you don't clean things. They worked in very, very clean spaces, and
Yes.
so these kitchens would also have people who did nothing but wash dishes
Mm.
all day, every day. That's the scullery, right? You just the complete dedication. But that was in the large kitchen. In the
Mm.
smaller kitchens, we actually, in Italy, for instance, we have ricordanze, and we have letters documenting life in a middle class kitchen, and we're talking merchant class, so not poor for
Mm.
certain, but the lady of the house is still working side by side with her servants
Yes.
in the kitchens. She's doing everything. She's baking the bread. She's ferment or preserving the meat. she's making sure the entire household is fed, right? So I'm confident it's probably similar in Ireland, that upper class kitchens were sort of professional, and then the middle class, even in the middling sort, the
Mm.
lady of the house would still have to probably pitch in. Do you have
Well, what's great
any
again
insight
is
into
that
that?
it goes back to the early medieval period with the saints' lives. We're mad to know what the different saints are getting up to. And as you were saying there about cleanliness, actually, we do have a tale that covers that with Saint Columba. As he's going over, he's in Iona, he's between Scotland and Ireland, and there is a tale of demons that pop up in buckets that are not cleaned and stuff, with the holy water and stuff, and it gives us a really good indication that obviously from because we think straight away, okay, if we clean a bucket, it stops us from getting sick. But it's very interesting that from St. Columba's interpretation, it is if you do not clean it with the holy water, a demon will be in the bucket. And so it gives us a really good idea, not just of the fact that they are actually cleaning. We have this idea
Right.
that they're not cleaning anything, that they're dirty all the time. In fact, if they're cleaning themselves with holy water, it gives us a good idea that they are actually cleaning everything. And although they don't understand the fact that they are getting sick, and we can see that also when the King of Munster is poisoned off the Enale, with my story early on. He's also possessed by a demon. It's
Ah,
this
right.
idea that although they don't understand what it is to be sick, their interpretation, and that's really what's interesting about the saints' lives, is that they're possessed by a monster or a demon or something has gotten inside of them, or a changeling or something on those lines. And
Right.
so even the fact that we
And
have these interpretations in the food.
food poisoning would could definitely present like demonic possession. I mean,
Yeah.
think about what's happening there.
Mm. Definitely to do with the saints' lives and stuff. Just popping back over to the comment section, John Hayes says there about what was it? Garlic. Yeah, you see a lot of garlic as well with the butter. We actually have food finds in Ireland where garlic is mixed in with the butter, especially bog butter, to improve the taste and stuff. So once again, it could be the fact that bog butter was terrible compared to nice fresh butter, and that
Right.
even the medieval people themselves may have been aware of this and may have mixed in with garlic to get rid of the taste of it. Now, I haven't tasted bog butter. I want to taste bog butter to see what the big deal is. Um,
Seriously. Like, now I want to try that.
yeah, just to see what the crack is, and then probably mix it in with garlic to see if it's as bad as everyone says. Medieval Ireland, where did they get its salt from? Obviously, famously, Ireland is notorious for having the Celtic culture link with Hallstatt up in the Alps of Italy.
Yeah, in
Um,
Austria. Yeah.
so we got our salt in from trade. Um,
But you
oh
can
yeah,
also, people
seaweed.
don't realize it's really easy to make salt if you live near the coast and you
Yeah,
have brackish waters. You can make, it's not the best quality salt, and in
yeah,
fact it was usually used for cleaning, but you get pans,
yeah,
metal pans, and you put the salt water in it and you boil it, and then you have salt behind. So
yeah.
there's,
That's
you know,
that's what Yuki was
it,
just roaring at me there about the salt of the sea and stuff. Um,
right.
where are we
Yeah,
going now?
but there's different grades of salt, right? So
Mm,
the usually that salt that they made from boiling away the brackish marsh water or seawater, that was actually used for cleaning.
yeah.
So that's how you would clean a wooden implements, is you'd scrub them with this salt. Again, they didn't understand why it worked, they just knew it did, and then
Mm,
you'd let them sun. You put them out in the sun, which in Ireland maybe is less common, but
mm,
in other parts of Europe where the sun shines more than 3 days a year,
yeah.
um, they would use the sunlight, and again they didn't understand that the UV light was actually, killing, irradiating the bacteria, but it
Mm,
worked.
yeah.
So on
And
to
then
that salt.
Ryan
I
comes
must
in with
stop.
a belter of a one saying that we harvest our tears for salt. Reminds me of the poor little boys in the Catholic schools not having their homework done.
Oh my God! Wow. Yeah, look at that. We harvested our own tears, Susan.
Yeah, very, very true, Ryan.
But yeah,
Obviously, then,
you're right. There was definitely a salt trade where the quality salt was probably brought in from somewhere else.
yeah. Then Susan asks, so the merchants didn't have ovens. They did, from my understanding, in both Kilkenny, where we have the Ellis Kettler text in the 14th century, and then we have the Men of Dublin as well, where there's plenty of people who are involved with the economics and finance. Obviously, I'm a bit dodgy about using the word bank in Ireland because proper modern banking that we know today doesn't really get introduced until the 17th century. But you do have people that kind of experiment and use different banks. For instance, Alice Kettler, who's in Kilkenny, was obviously educated by someone within the connections of the Knights Templars and stuff. So there is forms of banking in Ireland, but it's not our modern banking that we know from the 17th century in Ireland. And obviously, Rachel can
Right.
cover that in a different. We can talk about banking in a different
Oh yeah.
one.
Different chat.
Yeah, because Rachel, you're quite educated with banking and stuff with the Italian links, so I assume we could
Yeah.
do one with yourself.
Unfortunately, yes, I know a lot about banking.
Perfect. We'll cover banking later on. But my main
But the
point is
ovens. Yeah.
because these people had extraordinary connections with the wider world and stuff. Of course, the likes of Ellis Kettler, the people who were involved with the economics and finance of Dublin and Waterford. They had ovens. They made sure they had ovens. That
Yeah, so for certain, in 14th century Italy, I know that many merchants, especially the one I talked about, Margherita Dattini, she had an oven, but
yeah.
her ovens were not located in the main house. They were not located in the main part of the house. They were in the courtyard across the other side of the courtyard, because again, they didn't want the oven setting the house on fire.
Yeah.
So, depending whether a home had an oven or not, is also probably a function throughout because Europe is not a monolith.
Yeah.
We need to stress that. Depending on where you are, the size of your city, how densely packed your city is,
Mm.
and how big your home is, because a small home, an oven will not do. But
Mm.
also the thing is that to an oven is a high tech, highly complex piece of equipment in the sense of it requires a professional generally to know how to operate it,
Mm.
because maintaining the temperature in an oven, a medieval oven, is not just a is not there's no dial,
Mm.
right? So you have to stoke a fire, you have to understand how to build the fire, you have to understand how hot the fire is by looking at the coals and how much it's burned down, and then you have to scrape it all out, and at the time you think the temperature is actually right, because it's actually the residual heat in the oven walls that does the baking, not the fire. You get
Mm.
the fire comes out, so you don't put your bread loaves in there and just let them turn to charcoal, right?
Yeah.
So having an oven requires having enough servants to feed the oven, because you'll need someone to chop wood and to keep stoking the fire, and the lady of the house isn't going to do that. She will
Yeah.
do lots of things. She's not going to be there with an axe
Yeah.
chopping wood and stoking fire.
Yeah.
So
Especially when you're
whether a merchant had an oven or not, it really probably was a case by case basis,
yeah,
I
that's a
would
very
say.
good point actually. Yeah, because if you suddenly become bankrupt, there's no one really to pay them and keep them busy. Well, keep them working as he's doing the economics and finance. So it is a funny. It depends on his situation. But yeah, if he's expected to be doing economics and finance, hopefully he's making enough money so he can eat at the end of the day.
Right, and you don't now. Granted, that there, it was this true in Ireland. In most of Europe, there were communal ovens, like all of continental Europe and even England. There were communal ovens, right, where
Perhaps.
the baker operated the oven, and you would make the loaves yourself in your own kitchen, and then send them, and even dishes,
Mm.
you would send them to the baker to be baked. There's records in Italy of people making casseroles and pies and sending them to the baker to actually be baked, and then they paid the baker.
It,
Is that the case in Ireland as
That
well?
definitely sounds like something. I'm not going to say that and then have someone saying, oh, actually, there's not. But I assume in Dublin and Waterford for sure that would have happened. Obviously, you would have, if you're dealing with the Tuits way out in the countryside, when you're dealing with the clans and the Tuits, there would have been a different form again of that completely. But in Dublin and Waterford, I can definitely assume that they would have definitely had a form of that. It sounds like something that clicks in place, to be honest with you, for that kind of
Yeah,
communal thing going
it's
on and stuff.
right. It's most people think of when they think of a baker, they think of someone who actually makes bread, but a lot of bakers didn't make much bread. They actually just controlled the ovens and
Yeah,
literally baked.
yeah,
They're the ones who made sure the bread or the thing you sent to them didn't burn and that it was cooked properly, but they didn't actually make the thing itself, which is a very sharp contrast to a modern baker, right? Modern bakers are expected to make the thing and
mm,
then bake it, not just bake it.
yeah. So where's the next question?
Yes.
Uh,
Okay.
where are we? Boo, boo,
Let's see.
boo. We just did ovens. Bum, bum, bum.
Yes.
And then, oh yeah, grains and bread. Are we on that or still in ovens?
No, I haven't. I actually, so I'm, for whatever reason, my cultivated garlic came from Ireland. Oh, wait. Um, the last comment I can see is from Caravaggio.
Yeah, no
It's
problem.
true in England. That's where we got the hot pot because they would shout hot pot to get people to move out of the way in the streets. Ah, yeah,
Oh.
interesting. I didn't know that. Fantastic. Did you say there's a comment about grains or a question about grains?
Oh no, I think that's the well. That's what I have on my notes next is grains and bread.
Oh, okay. Right. Okay. So, are there
I
any
can.
other questions? Are there any questions about kitchens and facilities before we move on?
It's a quick. Whoopsies. I'm just flying through my phone right now.
Right. So yeah, we're to move on to ingredients then. So I'll just show you guys some imagery. So these are different kitchens. The one on the left is actually from the Decameron, from Boccaccio's Il Decamerone from
Mm,
the early 15th century. And again, you can see the kind of equipment they had. Roasting things did not happen. Nowadays, when we roast things, it
mm.
happens in a like a casserole dish or something. Back then, they spit roasted things, and some poor person, in this case, this poor wife, would have to sit there and turn the spit for hours. It's the most awful job in any kitchen is to be the spit boy, or in this case, the spit woman.
Wasn't
Um,
that? I'm gonna get corrected now in a comment section in a second, but I'm sure the Tudors, anytime they captured their pretenders and stuff, someone in the comment section
yes,
will definitely remember that particular pretender. Weren't they made into the Spit
yes,
Boys?
exactly. It was one of
Yeah,
the Edward
'cause
pretenders,
I think
right?
Warbeck was
Yeah,
killed. It was the other one that was
it
captured
was the other one,
afterwards. Yeah,
Perkins.
yeah, that's
No,
the
no, sorry.
one. He wasn't he
Uh,
turned into a Spit Boy afterwards
yeah,
as a
he was
form of
turned into a spit
humiliation.
boy, but apparently he actually lived a happy life
Yeah,
after that. So he was a happy spit boy, and probably I think I read that he actually worked his way up through the kitchens.
yeah, I heard
So
about that as well.
he didn't stay there forever, and he died. He lived a pretty good life as working in the royal kitchens.
Yeah, yeah.
So but yeah, spit boy, terrible job. I'm roaring fire, smoke because it doesn't all go up the chimney, and you're just it's so monotonous. You just have to turn the damn spit.
Yeah.
But if you look to the right on this slide,
Mm,
you've got some actual innovation happening. They're actually using heat to drive a turbine, basically,
mm,
because you can see the little chickens are spit on the spit, and
mm.
they've got it locked so that it's not turning at the moment.
Oh.
But if they unlock that fan, it will turn and it will turn the spit, and you no longer have to stand there and turn it yourself. So, like honestly, I would love some iron worker to make me this, and I'd like to set it up over a fire and play with it because this would be so much fun. But
What?
that's that's the kind of geek I am.
Why am I not shocked it's made in Germany? Because I'm like
Right?
looking
Yeah,
at this going,
exactly.
that's a
Yeah,
German
it's
invention.
from yeah from
Um,
the Küchenmeisterei. Yeah, not surprised that that kind of innovation would come out of Germany.
yeah, yeah,
No
yeah.
longer need a spit boy. You have the innovation of heat driven turbine. Pretty fantastic. And what most people might not realize is in the upper right hand corner of that same picture, those are frying pans.
Mm,
Those what looks like, I don't know, giant ladles, those are actually skillets. So when you talk about frying something in a medieval recipe, that's what they would have had, and they would have had to. They usually had a tripod that
mm.
the skillet would sit on over the flames, and you would stand way back at the end of that handle to, control it. So that's what a medieval skillet looked like. So
Oh,
anytime you think about cooking French toast or something on a medieval skillet, that's what you're using.
oh, we had a little bit of a correction there. It was actually Lionel was the spit boy, and Porbeck,
Lionel,
yeah,
yes,
yeah,
sorry.
and
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Perkin was
Perkin was
beheaded.
Warbeck, right?
Yeah,
Perkin was Warbeck,
I always get
right?
like,
Right, right,
and
right.
it's so important as well with Irish history. You think I would have gotten it right as well, but I actually always get mixed up with that one. So I actually have to write it down and actually drill it into my brain which one gets beheaded and which one ends up as the spit boy, because that's really important with Irish history, because it's just at the end of the Wars of the Roses as we're going into the Battle of Stokefield and stuff, and that book is coming out in August. There's a book coming out on the Battle of Stokefield in August, so definitely check
Mm.
that out, guys. Um, But yeah, before then and
Well,
all this stuff, I have to sit down and actually memorize properly which one ends up as the spit boy and which one ends up getting beheaded during the Tudor conquest. Well, is it Tudor? Yeah, I suppose it's going into the Tudor conquest.
I mean, it's kind of like every. It's funny how so many people think that the Wars of the Roses end in 1485, but they
Yeah,
don't.
yeah.
Actually,
They drag into this entire weird Irish camp because it kind of turns into this
exactly.
what was it called, stalemate between the Fitzgeralds and the Tudors, which then lingers into the Tudor conquest of Ireland. But a lot of people are just like, oh, 19, what was it, 1485, 1485.
1485.
Yeah,
Done. It's done.
yeah,
England is at peace, all is well, but
yeah,
it's actually not true because these pretenders keep cropping up, and the pretenders end up going to Ireland and trying to raise
yeah.
support there. And
Well,
yeah,
in my interpretation, they're the rightful kings, and Henry's the pretender. Remember that one?
I, Plantagenets forever, my friend. I agree with you.
Yeah, damn right.
I wish we could have seen what Richard III would have done
Hmm.
if he had. If because I think he was already heading in a good direction.
Well, it wasn't when he did that cavalry charge.
Well, no, that was a bad plan. But also,
Yeah,
he got betrayed. I mean, who
yeah,
would have guessed that one of the main forces that was going to support him decided not to?
yeah.
Um, and anyway, I guess he probably should have guessed that was going to happen because Stanley was a piece of poop. Anyway, um, moving on.
Uh,
Kitchen. Okay, so let's talk about ingredients, and I'm just going to leave this screen up as a for visual interest. Let's talk about ingredients.
oh yeah.
So we kind of did. I mentioned, that shipwreck, but I think the thing to lead with here is that starting from ancient Rome going forward, Europe has access to these amazing spices,
Mm,
at least at the upper levels of society, and and that's what everyone wants. They want food that's rich and flavorful, that's sharp, that's powerful. You've got a lot of vinegar, you've got a lot of sour and sweet, and just really rich flavors. And then even at the lower levels, you have lots of herbs,
mm,
like lots of herbs we don't even use anymore. Sorrel and penny royale. Not that you should necessarily eat that because it's technically toxic, but they did anyway. Um, you've got all these herbs that we just think of as weeds now
mm.
that they used to put in their food and eat as salads. At least in pretty much everywhere on the continent, Italy and what is now Germany, France, Spain, of course, had really interesting food thanks to their connections with the Arabic world, with the Moorish world.
Yeah.
So I know that Ireland had a lot of connections with Rome during the late Roman imperial period. Did these wonderful spices? I'm assuming they must have also made it to Ireland, at least at the upper echelons, right?
Well, there was a very good point there that Ryan had brought up. Is Ryan, if I can find Ryan's was it Ryan's comment? Oh no, it's
I think
John's
so. I
comment
think that
about families from Italy immigrating over, and we can see that as well with the Florence connection between the Fitzgeralds. That there may have been from that period of the 15th century onwards. We may have had, because we're definitely already having, with the High Middle Ages, we're having Spanish Iberians, as they were called at the time, coming from Spain, modern day Spain, over to where I'm from in Cork and stuff, with different food, well, not just different foods as well, but different skills and stuff, because one's a guitarist and stuff. So you have different people coming from Iberia going into Ireland and serving the Anglo-Irish. And it's the same thing
right.
with these Italian merchants and stuff that are coming in. Bankers is also a very the original Italian bankers that came into the country. Most likely, yeah. The whole thing of banking in Cork and stuff, it's a funny subject. Because although they bring in a form of banking, it is a very funny topic. But anyway, going back onto this main topic itself, um, food
Food,
groups.
food.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's definitely something I have to look deeper into, John. But you're right. The Florentines, as they were called at the time, and then later on the Italians, they have their entire history of the Italian Irish foods that are in Ireland, somewhat separate to England, because a lot of people look at English food and Irish food and they think they're somewhat similar, but there's actually an entire Italian connection in there. And obviously, as they're called today, they're actually, this is going to probably discuss Rachel now, but they're actually called, what was it, the Italian chippers in Ireland. So the Italian chippers in Ireland, what's that, Rachel?
What is a chipper?
So a chipper. So the idea of a chipper is that you get a potato. So they're basically French fries or American French fries, but we call them chippers in
Oh,
Ireland. And so in Ireland, all the Italians that immigrated in opened up chip shops and stuff. So we actually have an entire history. It's the same thing with Irish Chinese food. We have an entire history of Irish Chinese food. But yeah, a lot of Italians have always been coming in and immigrating. And one of the things they would bring in is all their Italian food. But it's mostly them making use of what was around them. So not only what they
right,
could trade in, but they would also use what was around them. So obviously, when the potato starts to come in, they start to make a whole load of potatoes to go with their Italian ingredients that are coming in by trade. So yeah, they're right. Not only would they have brought in different forms of banking, which you'll learn later on, but also at the time, there are also these merchants are coming in and setting up the merchant network into Florence would have brought in their food as well. So John is completely right in there that there you have that Florence link with where
right.
I'm from, in particular, the Cork and Kerry region. Um,
Right. Well, so let me talk then briefly about Italian food. So, what most people think of as Italian food now, and I say most people outside of Italy, because those of you who've actually been to Italy, the food we get outside of Italy ain't Italian for the most part. Anyway, most people think of tomato sauces and pasta, and the reality is that tomatoes don't start getting used in European cuisine until the 18th century. And potatoes don't really make their way into European cuisine until the 17th century either, because those are all New World plants. So for those who aren't aware, you've got these five major foodstuffs that are 100% New World and didn't exist in either Asia or Europe before the Columbian
yes.
Exchange. So you've got tomatoes, potatoes, corn, peppers, and there's another one. Well, there's a whole bunch of fruit anyway.
Yeah.
Um, but these four what in for most of Europe and Asia are considered like fundamental ingredients didn't exist. So medieval cuisine, whether it's in Asia or Europe, did not contain any of that. And so what medieval Italian cuisine and Renaissance cuisine is nothing like you would get in a restaurant now. Pizza, I've never found a reference to pizza in any Italian source, not visual,
Oh,
not
sorry, Rachel,
archaeological.
your camera's turned off there. Is there any way to turn it back on?
Let's see what happened. I don't know. Why
It's one
did
of
my
those
camera turn
flukes.
it?
I think your computer may have switched the other way around or something. Just
Um,
talking to Susan there.
it just
Did the
it just
Spanish
turned itself
introduce?
off for some reason.
Oh,
Okay, that's fun.
that's grand. It's somewhat back. Just answering this one off Susan there. Did the Spanish introduce saffron to Ireland? Yeah, there's a good chance that this goes way back to the Bronze Age, where there's a possibility of a Iberian. It's called the Iberian Celtic
Mm,
connection
right.
during the Bronze Age, and there's a lot of new research that's going into that. So I do assume that there is the Iberian Celtic, what was it, the Iberian Celtic trade connections that could have brought saffron into the country. So yeah, you're probably right there, Susan, about that. And
That's
also Ryan
or
taking
and
a
if
piss out of me there in the comment section.
oh, let me see. What did he say?
Chips are nothing like French
Wasn't
fries
that
there,
from
fellow.
nice? And if not that earlier, Celtic connection, then it could have the Romans at the latest by
Oh
the
yeah.
Romans, I would have imagined
Oh, big
at
time,
the
big
at the
time.
absolute latest. Yeah. So you those ingredients are gone,
Mm.
and medieval Italian food of this period um, would wasn't in terms of flavor profiles. Everything is very similar throughout medieval Europe at the upper end, right? The flavors and the sauces, you see lots of the same recipes cropping up in cookbooks across Europe from through the same period,
Mm.
different variations. But what the Italian cookbooks have a lot of that the other cookbooks don't, that modern people do associate with Italy, is pasta.
Mm.
The medieval Italian cookbooks are filled with ravioli recipes
Ravioli.
that just sound amazing and much more interesting than modern ones because they're filled with cinnamon and mace and cubebs and grains of paradise and pepper. And they do have cheese in them too, but they've got different kinds of cheeses than just ricotta cheese, which is mostly what ravioli are filled with these days. So definitely the this is something that has survived from the Middle Ages, is
Mm.
pasta as being a very Italian thing. In fact, um, here is where did the Where is that picture? Handsome, where did the picture of the pasta making go? Here. Here,
Oh,
dishes and techniques, right? So on the right here, you can actually, this is from Taquinem Sanitatis,
mm,
which is one of those health manuals that actually is a great source for medieval ingredients. They're making pasta,
mm,
and you can see they're rolling out the dough as you do, making the dough, and then you've got the pasta drying rack to the left. So yeah, so it's if you've got that Florentine connection, then it's entirely likely that maybe some of those yummy ravioli made their way into Dublin at some point in the
oh yeah,
15th century. That would be
definitely.
pretty neat.
Mm, mm, mm. Especially with that connection with Florence and stuff is what was it? John was pointing out earlier. So that definitely, I definitely would agree with John that we definitely would have been. Well, the two of us would definitely agree that the trade link between, especially Kerry and Cork area, definitely was impacted by Florence and stuff. And I do reckon that the bankers and stuff that came in would have brought in different food and different trade links in, especially if they're trading silk and wool and stuff. I could imagine food coming in and being traded amongst the people of Kerry and Cork with the likes
Right.
of the Florentines and stuff. So I could definitely see that as an impact. So that's a very good point there. Um,
So we had a question about sugar,
oh yeah.
cane sugar, and then wasn't that from Indio Caravaggio? No, it was from further than that. It was from Indonesia.
Oh.
Uh, sugar cane, grows in Southeast Asia, and it was absolutely a super luxury item until the end of the 15th century.
Mm,
And then in the 15th century, the Portuguese go and conquer the Azores, right?
mm,
The islands, the Atlantic islands off the coast of Africa, and they realize that it's the perfect climate to grow sugarcane.
mm,
And so they start growing sugarcane there. And so instead of sugar having to come all the way from Indonesia or Southeast Asia, it is brought, or India, I guess it is also grown in India, but its origins are further than that. Um, it, it now is able to be brought just from not very far away in Madeira.
mm,
And so it's called white gold because it's the reason that Portugal suddenly springs to this amazingly prominent, wealthy place on the world stage
mm,
because they've got the monopoly on local sugar.
mm,
And unfortunately for Europe, that means that people suddenly have massive access to sugar starting. Really, it starts in the second half of the 15th century, and then by the 16th century, it's so bad that people's teeth are rotting out. Like
mm.
Queen Elizabeth had almost no teeth left by the end of her life because she put sugar on everything.
Yeah.
But but if you look at skeletons before the 15th century, medieval European skeletons, other than their teeth being worn down from the stone dust in their stone ground flour bread,
Mm,
their teeth are actually in pretty good shape. But by the 16th century, Europeans are consuming sugars at a whole new rate. But in the medieval period, still, sugar was an extreme luxury item and used like salt was for the most part in those quantities. Like
yeah.
you would sprinkle some salt on, you would sprinkle some sugar on.
Mm,
I'm assuming probably in Ireland as well, sugar was equally and maybe even more so because it's even further
yeah.
from the point of origin.
I'm not
Do,
sure how it's coming into Kerry and Cork through the Italian link. I'm not sure about that. But it's definitely coming in from Bristol in England into Dublin and Waterford. And then if you go into the museum in Ireland, the Archaeologist Museum in Dublin, there's a skeleton of a Viking, and he has perfect teeth. Like he is, his teeth are so perfect. So we know, as you were saying there, before the 14th century, everybody's got perfect teeth. And then suddenly,
right,
if you read the records, then in Dublin and Waterford, after that, with the sugar coming in from Bristol into Dublin and Waterford, the teeth are suddenly falling out. We have loads of records of people having horrendous times
right.
dealing with sugar. And of course, the more countryside you go, the more up to the northwest of the side of the country, the more teeth are somewhat at least looked after, but teeth are torn apart.
Right. Yeah. It's yeah. And someone commented now sugar is in practically everything. Yeah. Or worse yet, high fructose corn syrup. There's a comment. It was sugar from the New World that became the food staple. No, sugar does not come from the New World. They didn't have sugar in the New World.
Mm,
So that's yet another thing that we've done
to the populations that predated the European colonization of the New World. We gave them sugar to help make them fat. Sugar is absolutely an old world item. Like I said, Southeast Asia. It's the sugar in Madeira that really jump starts the sugar consumption in Europe, not in the New World at all. So good, but thank you for making that comment because I have heard a lot of people say that sugar is a New World product, and it absolutely is not.
Oh, I've heard of that a few
Um,
times. All right.
yeah, that's another of those myths. Just looking through the comments. Uh, Yeah, so Ryan says, I thought I read accounts of Alexander the Great coming across it in India. Yes, he did. Absolutely, you are correct. There are accounts of Alexander the Great encountering sugar cane, and it is there as well. It's just that's not its original point of origin. But for certain, at some point, they did start growing sugar in India because sugar cane definitely grows well in the southern parts of India, which are very tropical.
Um, what was it? My wife actually had a very good point there about the oats and barley. She was popping her head in, and it was like, yeah, but the oats and barley, the seeds and stuff, definitely damage the teeth. We do have damage, especially from the lower classes and stuff, of the seeds
Yeah.
getting in and
Not the
damaging.
seeds, it's the sand.
Oh, the sand.
Yeah, when they were grinding it.
Exactly. Remember I said the stone dust from grinding flour? Yeah,
Ah,
that's so what happens is when you grind flour using one of those stone grinders, and I actually have one somewhere but not right at the moment accessible, stone dust ends up in the flour. And sometimes sand as well, but it's definitely stone dust. And that ends up baked into the bread and that grinds your teeth down. So yeah, you have teeth that are ground down from the stone dust, but it's not the same as rot from sugar, right?
yeah,
That's a
can
different
carry
ball of
very
wax.
damage.
Because
Yeah, but it's still
because the
interesting.
rot causes like diseases that will kill you because you'll get a brain infection eventually.
Oh no.
Yeah, so but grains are an interesting topic because of course this medieval Europe is definitely big on its grains. This is so, I in Ireland, what are the main grains that were eaten in the Middle Ages? Millet
Um,
and oats,
Obviously, we have
barley,
well, we have a lot of wheat and barley in Ireland, of course, because Ireland's notorious for the alcohol, isn't it?
right?
um, but of course, then we've got the old oats and barley. We have wheat. We have I always pronounce this incorrect. What was it? rye, isn't it? And
Rye,
then we
rye.
have the alternates, which is the old oak cakes, grinded cakes, and obviously baked in various open fires and stuff. So we have all that. It's pretty much the same stuff that's brought over from Bristol in England over to the Waterford and Cork area if it wasn't already introduced by the Romans, and then even before then with our Celtic culture link with modern day Europe and stuff. So a lot of the stuff that's very basic in Europe is also
Right.
seen in Ireland as well. Um,
You don't see oats so much in mainland Europe, interestingly.
yeah,
I think there's something, I think I remember reading there's something about the way the growing conditions that the conditions in most of Europe aren't right to grow oats. But I wish I'd done a little more research on that. But I was just realizing that almost none of the recipes uh, from mainland Europe contain oats, and I don't really recall reading much in the archaeological finds about, oat storage in this vessel or something like that.
oh,
But
oh,
definitely oats are big in the British Isles and in Ireland.
oh, is it? You see,
God knows.
now I feel ignorant because I just thought it was. You see, this is me just making assumptions. I thought it was standard. So I should have read
No,
up more into that so I could delve in deeper. I was just gonna go, okay, so that's oats and because everybody has oats, don't they? No. Okay, so
no.
that's my slap there for the day for assuming everybody had delicious beers and stuff. Uh,
Yeah, no, not oats.
yeah, yeah.
Another grain that a lot of people think is Asian is rice. But it is obviously rice does come from Asia and is Asian in its origin, but it actually it's very prominent in medieval cuisine as a sick person food because you have this dish blancmange, which is a chicken and rice dish cooked in oat milk, Jesus, no, almond milk, um, and it's described as being a thing you should eat when you're sick, right? So rice is actually very common in mainland Europe, and these blancmange recipes appear all the way up into England. So I probably in Richard II's cookbook as well. There's at least one, I think, two different recipes.
Oh, guaranteed.
So Yeah, so rice is another of these grains that people think is not, is has been introduced more recently into Europe, but in fact it's been here for quite a while.
Yeah, especially when you have
And
this Silk Road and stuff that's been there for quite some time now.
right. So talking about ingredients, so a lot of people assume that just because they had cabbage, talking about cabbage actually, they had cabbage in the Middle Ages, that it's kind of cabbage we have. But I specifically chose some of these pictures so that people could get an idea of how cultivars have changed drastically. So, like on the far right screen, you have cabbage. That's how cabbage looked in the Middle Ages. Looks nothing like our modern heads of cabbage.
Yeah,
Um,
it does highlight the importance of actually looking at the the photos with the sources, because I'm used to actually just reading it, and it's the first time actually seeing an image, and I'm like, okay, so that's foreign and alien to me.
Yep. And the thing is that most modern cultivars have been selectively bred over the last several centuries, um, specifically to maximize output, to maximize profit, usually. So, if you think about it, a head of cabbage that grows, or cabbage that grows like this little tree, that's not very efficient. Whereas lots of little heads that are really compact with lots and lots of leaves in this tiny space, that's way more efficient. So, you selectively breed for that, and then you end up with cabbage ball instead of tree of cabbage. If you think about watermelons, this is what a watermelon is according to Tequinem sanitatis in the middle, right? There's no stripes. They're much smaller than, modern watermelons. Then we have asparagus to the left. Most people don't see asparagus in its natural state, but it actually kind of looks like that if you harvest it if you wait until it sprouts to harvest it.
Yeah.
Um,
It's so fascinating. I think people in the comment section will definitely agree with me. As I was saying just there, like, this is completely alien. Like, really, all three of the pictures are completely alien, because I'm so used to actually just reading all that writing and stuff. This is the first time actually looking at the pictures, and now I'm like completely caught off guard and feel very ignorant to what's going on now, because I literally, as we were talking about this yesterday, and it was the same thing with curry earlier. I seen the word and was just like, oh, surely people didn't have curry back in the day and stuff. And it's the same thing with the cabbage now, where I read the cabbage and just assumed from my modern interpretation it's cabbage that we're used to. But now you're showing me these pictures, and once again I'm caught off guard and going, geez, actually I'm very ignorant when it comes down to this stuff of medieval food, thinking I'm an all know it all.
yeah, I mean, it's when you start medieval food, the quest for authentic medieval food is a bottomless pit, because there's always one more layer of authenticity to which you can aspire, right? And once you've kind of conquered what you think is the techniques in the recipe, then you turn your attention to, well, what are the actual medieval cultivars, and can I still procure them in the modern day, right? So Taquinem Sanitatis is actually a fantastic resource for medieval foodstuffs, because it actually depicts them in a very realistic manner. Whereas there's like no other, still lifes don't become a thing until the end of the 16th, the early 17th century in Europe, right? So before that, art is not focused on food stuffs, but these health manuals are. So here, I don't know, has the screen changed yet for
Yeah,
you?
yeah, that's switched
To
around, alright.
squash, yeah, right. Okay, so now these are squash and these are sour pomegranates. And what most people don't realize, modern people realize, is that pomegranates, there was a sweet variety and there was a sour variety. And when a medieval recipe calls for pomegranate juice, it's usually calling for the sour variety, which is why it can be substituted with lemon juice. So, if you read a recipe, and oranges, by the way, people, oranges were not sweet. They did not used to be sweet. Oranges and lemons used to be swappable in recipes because they were sour and acidic. You would not eat an orange in the medieval period unless you were being paid to do so, probably,
It's crazy
or you
because
lost a bet.
Uh, it's crazy because this looks like an alien planet to me. Like, I can't highlight enough how different this looks, which completely changes my interpretation. And I hope people viewing this today has the same kind of look that I'm having right now. That is dealing with a completely different universe. And I know people have this thing of comparing themselves to the medieval period. But Jesus, like Rachel, you're really highlighting the fact that it's not the case at all. We're dealing with an alien planet here.
It's a different world. You know, a lot of the you read a recipe and you're like, yeah, this seems vaguely familiar, and then you look at the ingredients, you're like, nope, I don't know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Like here, can you see? Did the screen change for you? We've got lettuce and Palestinian melon. So you look at this lettuce, this is not what we think of as lettuce, right? It's
Mm,
this really leafy, very leafy thing. It's not, it's narrow and and probably this was bitter. It was medieval lettuce was no doubt much more bitter than modern lettuce. So, you know, even in the basic ingredients, medieval ingredients were not nearly as sweet as their modern equivalents.
mm, mm.
But just from the base, food is less sweet before you even start talking about spices and flavorings.
That's fascinating.
Um, yeah, but then some things are very similar. So here's leeks. Those look just like modern leeks. Like that's very much a leek. I look at that and I recognize that as a leek. So that's nice. And spinach. What's interesting about this picture of spinach, this isn't how spinach usually looks when you get it in Europe, but it is how spinach looks in Korea here. We can go to the market and buy spinach that looks exactly like this in these massive bundles.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, and I'm wondering if the European cultivar was actually closer to the medieval cultivar was closer to the modern Korean one. But
That's
yeah, there it
yeah.
is.
That's exactly what I'm thinking. And Rachel, you could easily correct me on that one. But is it just the fact that we've kind of bastardized our evolution of food into the way it is today, that's gone away from its natural progression? Like it's just very, very
Yeah,
interesting to me. Like,
it's like is I heard there's another creator on YouTube, CGP Grey, and he called them monstrous versions of their original selves.
mm,
Like he
mm,
was referring to strawberries actually, because you know modern strawberries are getting to be almost fist sized
mm,
in some cases. And if you look at a wild strawberry, it's this tiny little thing that's you know the like the tip of your pinky.
yeah,
It's tiny and they're not very sweet.
mm, mm,
So and it was actually I think it was a 14th century king who decided he wanted to selectively breed strawberries and actually started intentionally he had them planted in his garden and intentionally bred so that they could get bigger and sweeter and juicer.
mm.
I think I wish I'd taken better note of that. I read it yesterday
Yeah.
and it was
It's
interesting.
it's
Sorry,
very.
dear viewer, I have failed you.
It's okay. I am in a state of shock as well with the images they're showing me because it just reminds me of how we've done the same thing to animals, in particular cats and dogs. How we've kind of
Oh God,
bastardized their
yeah.
growth as well, like, and to see that we've done it exactly the same to nature as well is quite intriguing to me. We've truly destroyed this planet.
You know, we really haven't. You know, it's not just the flavors, but the medieval cultivars when they've like done analysis on them are more nutritionally the extant ones they find in these weird ways.
Oh yeah, I'm not
Um,
shocked.
they're more nutritionally dense than the modern equivalent. So these modern ginormous versions of onions that we've bred, for instance, don't have more vitamins in them relative to a smaller, you know, exact large one, small one. The small one has the same number of vitamins as the large one,
Mm, mm,
right?
mm.
So just because you're making more calories doesn't mean you're actually making more nutrition.
Yeah,
Um, which is a kind of a scary thought to
yeah,
think that
yeah.
actually medieval people may have been nutritionally better off than we are from a micronutrient level.
And that's even
That's
before we get into the junk food and the fizzy pops and everything. I think somebody was saying about the damage we've done to the what was it? The local people in Okinawa. Okinawans used to live the longest in the world now, and in recent statistics in the last 5 years, their place in the world has suddenly dropped, and they're starting to balance off with us because of the amount of unhealthy food we've brought into the country, and of course, then the plastic introduction has wrecked up their water supply. Oh my God, the damage we've done to Okinawa is horrendous.
yeah, it's the same. It's happening in Korea.
Yeah,
If you look at the younger generations of Koreans, they eat Western food, and it shows. I'll just leave it at that. Cardiovascular disease and diabetes are on the rise here.
yeah.
Um, so there's a good comment here. wait, was it? Oh yeah, Ryan. Thank you, Ryan, for all of your fantastic comments. Interesting, and thank you all of you for having such a lively chat today. This has been great. We really appreciate you all
Oh yeah,
joining us.
definitely.
But Ryan says, interesting that in some ways, I was about to comment on this, which is why I'm glad Ryan did. Interesting that in some ways the high class food is worse for you than the lower class food, like white bread. Yes, indeed, my dear Ryan, you are 100% correct. The medieval peasantry, people always think, oh, the poor peasants, they were starving, but that's like a Victorian view of poverty. Medieval peasants were actually pretty comfortable, except in times of famine. But in normal times, they had a pretty nutritionally dense diet because they were eating root vegetables. They were eating whole grains, although whether whole grains can be really bad for you unless you sour them, which they did because their bread was all sourdough. There was no yeast raised bread in the Middle Ages. It was all sourdough. But white people, Jesus, the nobility were eating white bread, which has zero nutrients. It's just calories. That's all it is. It's pure calories because their flour was not enriched with vitamins. So when you take all the vitamins out via the bran, all you have left is pure calories. So yeah, Ryan, you're absolutely right. The wealthy people were, getting gout by eating meat and white bread, and almost no vegetables, relatively speaking. Meanwhile, the peasants are eating a very whole grain and root vegetable rich diet. Because there was also this weird classism in medieval food theory that anything that grew below the ground, peasants could eat. But the things that grew above the ground were for the nobility. So,
I think Henry VIII was one of the best examples of that, and yeah, he lived a pretty sane life. Was pretty healthy in his old age.
oh yeah, absolutely. He was the model of the modern man, shall we
Oh, for
say?
sure.
Now that we've had a resurgence of gout everywhere in America,
Oh,
great.
stop. It's getting very bad in Ireland as well. And as I was saying
It's
earlier,
really
we're
bad.
bringing these beautiful habits into Asia now, into Australia and
I
into,
know.
what was it called? Okinawa and into
The
Korea and
gift of
stuff. So,
Western culture, it just keeps on giving. What can I say?
oh, I wouldn't mind a drink of Coke right now, though.
So comment, everything seems more herbaceous in flavor profile, a lot earthier in a sense. Food as essential medicine rather than dopamine producing. That's the comment from Caravaggio. Yes, absolutely. Spot on. And even though the medieval people mostly didn't seem to understand why certain foods were actually good for you because it was all about humoral health, the four humors, and whether it was hot or cold or dry or wet, and choleric or biliac or whatever, they still seem to recognize that foods were medicinal because they are, right? Every foodstuff has some kind of active ingredient chemical in it that's going to interact with your body in either a good way or a bad way. And yeah, they definitely focused on nutrition from their version of nutrition, which is not necessarily our version of nutrition, because they use sugar like a medicine. It was considered medicinal, which we know it's not. Yeah, I'm assuming that the four humors were probably also a going concern in Ireland, since the
Yeah.
monks
We
would
had,
have brought
yeah,
that with
it
them.
was as you said there, the monks that brought it into. So you do have it even in McCarthy territories and stuff when they bring in the Franciscans and the other holy orders into those areas. The books that they bring in from Europe talk about the four humours and stuff. So the likes of even the Gaelic lords, like the McCarthys, like the O'Briens and stuff, would have been educated about this with Europe. And of course, because they want to be more European, they want to be more connected, they fully subscribe to all of this that the Franciscans and stuff bring in, and they're giving them money to bring more of this information in for them. And of course, notoriously famously, you have the likes of the Wizard Fitzgeralds and stuff, who were very connected with the Renaissance
The
in
Wizard
Europe.
Fitzgeralds,
Yeah.
that's great. That's a fantastic by
um,
name.
yeah, there's actually two of them. There's the one in the Tudor period, and then there's another one. So there's a Kildare one that pops up in the Tudor period, and then there's also one that's much more earlier on. And the Wizard Fitzgeralds, they're notorious for going into Italy in particular, and they get all these textbooks and stuff, and then they come back into Ireland, and because they're so educated with the likes of the Italian maths, the Italian working with chemicals and stuff, people think they're magical wizards, and so they think
Right, of
the
course.
Fitzgerald is a magic wizard. So they give him, the locals give him the name the wizard Fitzgerald, and he's notorious for
And he
being
was
very
really just
educated.
an alchemist in
That's the
essence.
word. That's the word I'm looking
Yeah,
for. He's very
yeah.
educated with that, and of course, and they're paying the local clergy to bring more of this stuff in from Italy, and also southern Germany to further their education and stuff. Because the
Mm,
Irish love
makes
this,
sense.
especially the as we were saying a few weeks back, the Fitzgeralds in particular love this information.
Yeah, it's again the ways in which all of Europe is connected with itself and also to the, the greater world at large. It's always it makes me so happy to build these connections because it makes my idea of the world more complete. And yeah, I know I'm weird like that, but there it is. So I just wanted to talk briefly about the price of spices because modern people don't understand just how expensive some of these spices were. Peppercorns were apparently utilized in many parts of 13th and 14th century Europe as currency. So you could actually use a single peppercorn to make a payment of rather sizable quantities because that's how expensive these spices were. Apparently, a 6 grams. I found one record from a German expense account. 6 grams of 6 grams as per their measurement, which is not necessarily our gram measurement. I just like to make that clear. 6 grams of nutmeg was worth 7 oxen.
Jesus.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, that's a
Jesus.
good bit, like especially ox.
I mean, yeah, I mean, 7 oxen. So that kind of should help people visualize just when we say expensive, we really mean it. We're talking almost the price of gold in
Yeah.
some cases. So it's, weight for weight. So really, these spices were definitely the upper class or the extremely wealthy merchants, not your peasants would not have had access to these unless they were given as a gift, or a form of payment. Because, like I said, peppercorns were apparently used as a form, like salt was used in the Roman Empire to pay soldiers, hence the word salary. Peppercorns apparently came to be used to pay people in various parts of Europe in the 14th and or 13th and 14th centuries at least. So, wow.
That's very interesting because using food groups as a form of currency, especially like so, I'm assuming that's more of the urban area where people are doing that.
Yeah, I mean, for certain, well, yeah. So,
Because for me,
I would
that's
assume
very
it
kind
would
of
be
alien
probably
for me.
it
Okay.
right. It might also be probably in places where there are manor houses, like
Okay.
lordly manor houses. I
Yeah.
would assume also.
Be-
So even out in the country where you have these manorial estates that are kind of self-sufficient, um, and it might be a more in many cases it's more useful and more
yeah.
durable in terms of value than gold than coinage is, right? Because coinage can inflate or deflate, whereas a peppercorn is a peppercorn.
Yeah, that's very, very true.
And
It just blows me away because I always assumed that when we're dealing with the likes of Dublin and Cork and then its connections over to Florence, that we would have been dealing with hard cash the entire time, and that it was in fact out in the countryside when we go into the likes of the O'Donnells and the O'Neills and the O'Connors, those territories, then we're dealing with cattle currency, currency basically. But now you're saying that
right.
you're completely getting the old rug and sweeping my legs and saying actually there is actually a form of food currency going on between was it perhaps Cork and Florence and stuff, which to me is just intriguing, like.
Yeah, it could be. Now, granted, I will say that in the 15th century account books, I have yet to see an entry for peppercorns being used as a monetary amount. But like, that's why I specified 13th and 14th century, and that kind of makes sense because that is really, if you think about monetary systems, they're not necessarily quite so stable in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries yet, right?
Yeah, yeah, especially when
Monetary system is kind of still building and
yeah.
developing.
Especially when you have so many soldiers with the old IOU jobs, especially with the Lanzknecht in Italy and stuff, where wasn't it
Right.
both Maximilian and Charles V couldn't pay the military, and so the Lanzknecht and eventually
Chronically
ended up sacking
broke.
Rome. Yeah, but yeah,
Yeah.
um,
So then they sack Rome.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then obviously then we'll have what was it? The Gallo Glass companies in Ireland, and they're being paid in cattle from time to time. And then what happens is the English cop onto that, so they end up having a scourge policy of just destroy the wilderness, so they can't, so the O'Neills can't pay their men anymore in cattle tributes
Right.
and stuff. So it's a funny business, like um,
Okay, well let's move on to some actual dishes. We have sort of talked about it, but we'll cap it off with. I figured we talk about some actual dishes from the Middle Ages. And actually, I let me see if I can actually see my screen. Um, am I still? I've got
oh yeah,
unfortunately my great. Okay, so this
oh
is gingerbread. This is actual medieval gingerbread, and I baked a loaf of sourdough bread a month ago. And it's thankfully it's sourdough, so it doesn't really mold. And it's just kind of slowly dried, but it's not completely dry. And I grated it, and this is what medieval gingerbread was. It was breadcrumbs with honey that's been cooked to a soft candy temperature and a whole bunch of really powerful spices,
mm,
including ginger. And then it's formed into this. I can form it into different shapes. I didn't get very fancy with it, but I could have like molded it into a rose or something like that. So,
mm,
um, I think one of the, and I didn't mention this, a thing they didn't have before the 18th century, chemical leaveners
mm,
did not exist. There was no baking powder, there was no baking soda. And so most things outside of bread that we now leaven modernly, cakes and whatnot, cookies, were not leavened in any way. So they were much denser, they were much harder, they were not fluffy and moist and light and crummy, right? So um, if you read a medieval recipe for a cake, it's not a cake like we think about cake. Do not get that misapprehension. In fact, Philip, you mentioned oat cakes, I
mm,
think, which are basically like hardtack. They're
yeah.
like, uh, yeah, they're hard and they'll last forever, God knows. And you can take it and you can eat it on the road and you will get your nutrition, but it will not be a necessarily enjoyable experience
Especially to the
for you,
teeth.
right? Especially your teeth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Um,
so were you able to find any specific dishes
well, to
in any
start with,
of
we've got the
your?
old gruel that you were talking about. Did we talk about that
Yeah.
last time, or did we talk about that just between ourselves? Because we always have gruel on the just cooking
I think
over
we
the
talked.
fire.
Yeah, we I think we talked about it between ourselves. But
Yeah.
yeah, in Ireland, is that's also a
Yeah,
practice
we
to
have
just keep
porridge and
a.
gruel. Porridge and gruel. There's an entire custom around it that actually went all the way up to 1969, and we might even find places in Ireland. I think either Ryan or the others will actually butt in there and correct me on this one. But I think there's accounts all the way to 1998 of having a culture where people would just rock up, get a bit of porridge, and just munch away on it, or even just cook their own food. So yeah, Ireland also has that culture of people just,
Wow.
even travelers just traveling by all the way up to 1969 in Ireland. You would have had travelers that would have just walked in while the wife was working away and stuff. You would have had a traveler, a storyteller, or a tinker, a man who worked with tin and stuff, walk into the house, just get a bit of porridge and just munch away on it, talking to the old wife as though he knew her, and then left the house and went on,
Wow.
continuing his travel again. So yeah, porridge and gruel was always there, cooking away. Of course, we were just talking about oat cakes, coddle, which I'm not true. A
Bottle.
lot of Dublin
Mm,
people
I mean,
would have known about this. What is coddle stew? But I'm actually completely unaware of this. So, in out in the countryside in the medieval period, we would have been had access to cattle. But if you're living in the urban areas like Cork, Dublin, Waterford, etc., the problem is you don't have the room for cattle. But what you do have the room for is pigs. So you're able to have
right.
pigs outside in your back garden, or depending on wherever you are, or maybe you're working with your neighbour and stuff to build a little area to keep pigs in. And then you would have gotten the pig, cut them up and stuff, and made a pork stew. And that pork stew then would have been coddle. Now, these days, when you say that to a Dublin person, because this becomes famous in Dublin, they think of the potato and pork coddle that they know today. But obviously, when we're
Right.
dealing with the medieval period, it would have been different again. So the main ingredient, instead of beef, would have been pork, and then it would have been whatever you had would have been choked into the stew. And the stew, exactly how we would have had the porridge, would have been put over the fire and left there, so people would have come in, munched away on the codle stew, and then continued their business throughout the day. Once again, stews are a huge part of Irish society. You build the big massive cauldron. We have loads of tales as well. If you look at the likes of, do we have books? Oh yeah, here we go. The Celtic Heroic Age. You would, in this one, obviously it goes on about the Celtic culture and the Celtic links it is with the cauldron, where you have a cauldron and then you have a certain stew inside. But sometimes the cauldrons have a certain magic to them, where you could put your hand in and you'd get your as they call it, the champion's portion, where it puts your, your status within the society. You put your hand in and it gives you the correct food to your status. And so this is very much glorified within Celtic stories that we find both in Ireland and in the continent.
I see.
During the early medieval period, which is very interesting. So you are dealing with a very community society. So of course you're dealing with a lot of stews in Ireland. Also, it depends where you are in Ireland. Exactly in Europe, where we were dealing with different food groups, the same thing is in Ireland. So if you live more in the coastal areas, where in the urban areas they're eating pork and a mixture of fish, and also out in the countryside they're eating beef. If you are living more in a kind of port village, your diet is going to be mostly fish. I don't think we covered fish yet. But I can.
No, we haven't actually talked about fish at all. The poor fish.
I know.
We've ignored them.
But
well, that's not true. We talked about rotten fermented fish. Remember, we talked about the lutefisk.
So in Ireland, obviously, salmon is very romanticized. We have lots of stories of the ancient Irish warriors getting a hold of salmon and it being referred to as the salmon of knowledge. So there's a lot of
salmon of knowledge.
Yeah, did you not hear about the salmon of knowledge?
That's fantastic. No,
it's really famous medieval. What was it? The story itself that we know today is somewhat medieval, but it may have even more ancient roots. But yeah, it has this warrior. I think it's Finn McCool. That he catches the fish, or it's probably the other way around. Someone's going to correct me on this one, but he catches a fish anyway, and then his student that he's teaching how to become a warrior and stuff, or he's educating him. It's something anyway on those lines. He ends up biting the fish. My wife's going to... Who's that?
He's the student.
Finn McCool's the student.
Yeah. Looking for his master.
Okay, so Finn McCool is the student, and he's told he has to watch the fish. So whoever bites into the fish first gets all the knowledge. So he tells the master needs to go and get, I think it's either more wood or something, but he needs to go off and do business, right? So he tells Finn, watch the fire, make sure no one touches the fish, because the fish has all of the knowledge. Because it goes back to, you know how people would pass away and then they would come back.
Oh,
There's
I see, right.
Connections, even with the Arthurian legends of people coming back as food.
Right.
So there's one Arthurian legend of Arthur himself coming back as an apple and stuff, because he's buried with the apple. With an apple coming out of his grave. And it's the same thing in Ireland as well, with someone coming back as a fish and then having all that knowledge. And obviously Finn McCool's master wants the knowledge, so he believes if he bites into it first, he'll get all the knowledge and become insanely rich of knowledge. So he gets his student Finn McCool to watch the fish. Finn McCool's there watching the fire simmer away, and then suddenly there's a spark off the fire. It gets onto his finger. He sucks the finger, and with that he sucks all the knowledge of the salmon of knowledge. So yeah, in Ireland we have loads, even mythology around food. So we also have trout, eels, and we have cod. So basically any of the local fish in that area in Ireland we're able to fish up then, and we also then have different boiling, grilled and smoked techniques that go with that, and obviously we would have had our herbs that would have mixed in with the fish as well. And obviously with that then we have, and another thing as well, we have wild game as well, anything we could hunt. So obviously in the urban areas we have domesticated pigs, we also have domesticated cattle, but we also have wild game as well, game that we can go off and hunt as well. But sadly, if you're the common low class level, you're not allowed to go into the forestry to go and hunt for this game. So it would have been just the noble classes then that were allowed to hunt the deer, bring that back, and then roast it or spit roast it, or even stew the deer and stuff. You
Right.
would have, the lower classes are not allowed to be touching the lower class deer unless it was the leftovers on Christmas or something like that. But okay, normally, just like in Europe, you were not allowed to touch the deer and stuff. That was for the upper classes to hunt for themselves and also bring back. And if you were captured, there were various punishments to do with that.
Yeah, it's a, it's definitely an English thing. The prohibition on deer in Europe really kind of depends on where you are, because um, in a lot of places there aren't necessarily, kings. There's a lot of city states. There's a lot of more urban habitation where they're much less concerned about that. Um, but fish, goodness knows, fish anywhere, and even in places that aren't on the coast, most people don't realize that in the Roman times, and even in medieval times especially, people had fish ponds where they would farm fish so that they could have fresh fish, even though they weren't necessarily near a river or a lake or a greater body of water. So, yeah, I think it's, a lot of, I do love to say Europe is not a monolith, but on the other hand, there are lots of commonalities. And I would say actually, something we haven't talked about is in in the relationship to food, is the relationship between food and the church, and the fact that you've got this actually monolithic, overarching church that basically, sort of super rules Europe, with all of these rules about what you can eat and when you can eat it. Because we haven't talked at all about fasting days.
Oh,
3 days a week on the medieval calendar. 3 days a week were fish days. So, Mondays or Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays, or Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays were fish day, ember days, or maybe Saturdays, some Saturdays. Anyway, they're called ember days. And those were days where you weren't supposed to eat meat. And so these cookbooks are filled with fish recipes, or the recipes have alternatives for the same recipe for what you should do if you're making it for a fish day. So, instead of cheese, you use almond cheese. Well, almond butter, they call it. Or, instead of meat broth, you use fish broth. So yeah, I'm assuming that those same rules probably applied pretty stringently in Ireland with its,
Oh, big
you
time.
know,
You can see that
yeah.
once again if we go back to the Saints' lives, in particular that vision we were talking. Well, I say vision.
Call
We
it
were
what it
talking
is,
about earlier.
man.
It actually talks about what was it? God, you literally just said the word fasting. It literally does talk about fasting even on top of that. But what's interesting is the king becomes sick. Now, most of the time when a certain noble becomes sick, you have all this mad stuff going on where they're cutting them and they're leeching them and they're doing all these weird experiments on them. But weirdly enough, in this one, he is told to fast because there is a demon in him. They tell him you should fast for a few days, which actually I think for somebody who's dying from food poisoning is actually not a bad idea. Instead of like cutting him up and doing all kinds of wild experiments on his body, to actually have him fast for those few days. While he's fasting, by the way, this is where we go back to the Irish American link. The whole time you have the monk is making him what was it, corned beef, was it corned beef and cabbage in the background. He's getting a few days, he's getting the beef in, he's cutting it up. So it actually goes into the description of while the king is fasting, you have the monk in the kitchen, and afterwards, because the monk is so good, his food is so good, the king is like, I want to hire you as my chef. And the monk is like, no, 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 sure, I'm a monk, I can't be a chef. Once again, going back into the importance of food within the literature is quite interesting in itself. Yeah, we have all these kind of different foods as well, because I have a full list in front of me of like herbs and vegetable soups, stuffed dishes, sweet and spice dishes. Like it says here, I've got one here called rice pudding. I don't think we had rice in that period, did we?
Yeah, so definitely in the medieval period you did. Now
Oh, did
whether
we?
Ireland had it or not, but oh yeah, that's the remember I talked about the blancmange, the rice and chicken dish.
Mm.
Yeah, rice is definitely it grows very well in Italy
Yeah,
and Spain.
because I actually
Um,
have that. I was this was another one that kind of stunned me yesterday. Never mind the curry, but I do actually have that on my list as well. Is rice pudding, which is made up of
I'm
rice, milk, and honey, and it came in from
yeah.
the link from Bristol into Dublin. So allegedly, obviously, you think it's the same thing as well, where the link from Bristol into Dublin is bringing rice pudding, which is quite interesting. Is it the same rice that we would have seen early on?
So probably from what I understand, I think it was long grain rice, not short grain rice.
Mm.
Um, but I haven't I'm trying. If I have this blank expression on my face, it's because I'm traipsing through my memories. Um,
That's grand. I kind of caught you off guard
um,
with that one.
yeah, I mean, so there's so many cultivars now. I'm going to assume that it was probably a different kind.
Mm.
But they definitely did have the sources do acknowledge the difference between rice with the bran and rice without the bran.
Mm, mm, mm.
Just like you have wheat with the bran and wheat without the bran. And there's actually an art manual from the 15th century that talks about things you can do with the bran that's been removed from rice and from wheat. Um, but that rice pudding is definitely I've definitely seen recipes. Uh, Now we call it rice pudding. Of course, they didn't. The recipes don't call it pudding. They usually have some other kind of name, but it's basically what it turns into is a rice pudding. Although usually it's made with almond milk. Just there aren't many recipes using cow's milk for obvious reasons.
Mm, mm,
For
mm.
one, you want to turn your cow's milk into cheese and butter.
Yeah, they
Why
did do
would
that in
why
Ireland.
would you waste that cooking when you can have almond milk for your cooking
More
purposes?
bog butter.
Or bog, but oh God, I now
Uh,
I have to taste this. I just have to now.
you have
I'm
to. I have
sorry.
to as well. Since I heard it was Sheehan. It was Sheehan. It was definitely Sheehan who works up in UCC archaeology department. He's the one that brags about eating bog butter. That's absolutely disgusting.
Nice. Okay, so actually, there was a question or a comment that I wanted to address back to the idea of salt. Ryan very astutely observes salt didn't replace a legionary stipend, but complemented it as a ration. And yes, you are right. And I'm sorry if what I said implied that it was their complete pay. No,
Mm,
but that's where the word salary does come from, just so
mm,
people
mm.
know. Yeah, no, of course not. You can't live on just salt. That's ridiculous. If everyone's getting paid in salt, then everyone has salt, then no one wants to trade for it.
Yeah, that's
Um,
very true.
yeah. Let's see. Uh, oh, there's apparently Ryan comments there's a GEAS. I'm not certain what that word is against eating dog meat.
Oh God, oh, Yuki's just gonna the correct way how to pronounce that. That's the those like curses and stuff against eating dog and horse meat, but it's a
Yeah.
funny one because we also have sources of them in certain situations eating horse. I'm not sure about dog meat, but there is a few times when they're especially the warrior class are doing strange things around horse meat and stuff, but definitely around dog meat. And the thing about you see, I know what Ryan is talking about. I actually have gone through that source about 4 years ago or so, but I haven't touched that one for ages. But yeah, there's certain curses and stuff around eating certain kinds of meat, especially around horse and dog
Interesting.
meat. But horse is a very funny one because every once in a while you come across a source, especially towards the warrior class, both the Ustmen, the Irish Vikings, and the Gaelic warriors eating horse meat. And then there's the huge arguments and debates, especially that Gerald of Wales starts around because Gerald of Wales claims that the kings of Ireland were doing jiggy jiggy with horses and then eating them afterwards, also battling with
Wow.
them. Um,
Classy.
but even on top of that, it's a very, very, very funny subject and starts a lot of arguments within the academic world. So yeah, so I know what Ryan's talking
Wow.
about, but I haven't read it for some time. Um, yeah, we have the source from the tone as well. Oh yeah,
Yeah,
I
so
know.
Horse in mainland. So horse is still eaten to this day in Finland. Neither horse nor dog make an appearance in any of the medieval culinary sources I've read for Europe. I do know that references are made to eating horses when there's a siege on,
Yeah,
and dogs, which leads me to believe that it's not in most of mainland Europe. In any case, it's definitely not a common dish, whereas it is, you know, dog is definitely a common dish in many parts of Asia, although it's just got outlawed in Korea. So
yeah.
those restaurants are going away here. But
Yeah, China's a
yeah,
funny one because dealing with China, we have to remember that there's regions where food is very scarce.
yeah,
And you can find that even in their medieval periods, that they're even resorted to where cannibalism is kind of. I remember China's very, 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 very big. So when we're reading even medieval sources, there's some part sometimes in the medieval source where cannibalism is even kind of normalized because famine is constant. And
right.
you have to remember that it's because China's so humongous that they do actually. So in parts of like Hong Kong, for example, eating dog is completely frowned upon. But then there's other parts of China where Chinese people come in, they eat dog, and it's a huge class of cultures between people of Hong Kongese and outsiders coming in. So you do have different parts of
Yeah,
Asia where it's heavily, massively frowned upon. Like where I am here in
yep,
Okinawa, hugely frowned upon to even look at the dog
yeah,
half crooked. The Japanese absolutely love their dogs, wouldn't even touch them. But then you've got other parts of Asia where it's like, well, it's common because there's a lack of other ingredients and stuff. So we do have to keep that in mind when we're talking about the larger scale
yeah.
of what is considered normalization because of the lack of other food groups and stuff, and even
Yeah,
turned into the
it's
culture of that area.
exactly. And like it's just as I say, Europe is not a monolith. Asia is definitely not a monolith
Yeah.
at all in
Um,
any way.
because we have a
Yeah.
tale in China. I can't. Yuki can correct me on this one, where there is an emperor who's coming to see a lord. Uh,
Kingdoms.
is it in the Three Kingdoms? Where yeah, so in the Three Kingdoms, there's a
Romance of True Kingdoms.
is the emperor who comes to see a lord or
He's one of
something?
the generals.
Yeah, so an emperor is coming to see one of the generals, and
He's not an emperor.
oh, so the general is coming to see one of the lords, and he doesn't have any food, so he literally chops up his wife and feeds the wife to the general, and the reason why that's considered normal,
It's
no,
not normal. It's an act of honor.
yeah, it's the act of honor.
I'm willing to sacrifice my wife for you.
Yeah. The reason why that's happening is because of the level of famine. Famine is so normalized by the time we get up to that period because the War of the Three Kingdoms in China goes on for so long that famine becomes a
Right.
regular occurrence. So with that, cannibalism is starting to become normalized, and we have to keep that in mind when we're dealing with larger areas of Asia. Um, that's what eventually
Uh,
happens. That people have different interpretations when it comes down to food and stuff.
Survival is always the number one directive.
Mm.
So, we all like to think that we're super civilized and we would never stoop to such levels, but the reality is that most of us in the modern Western world especially have never faced
Yeah,
that level
and
of hunger.
we can't say anything because the same thing happens in Ireland with Carrickfergus Castle. So in Carrickfergus Castle, we have kind of hints at cannibalism happening a few times during the siege. So
Right.
Carrickfergus Castle gets sieged a lot by both the Irish and the Scottish, and because of that, there's certain indications where hostage taking is given. So they're switching hostages around and stuff. So just to keep you in line, I'll give you one of my men as a hostage, but then that hostage disappears, and it's heavily indicated that he became food. So to turn around and
Right.
say, "Oh, we're better than them" or anything, that's not true. It's also the case in, especially around Carrickfergus and stuff, where cannibalism can become normalized quite easy. Which wasn't
Um, yeah, so cannibalism, it's funny. Ev- every society has probably yielded to it at some point.
it?
The reality is. Um, but back to the topic of specific dishes. At the beginning of the chat, Susan actually asked about favorite dishes in various regions in the medieval period, and of course, the medieval period is also a massive period. But in examining, as I have examined so many different resource sources for different regions of Europe, because my interests are very wide ranging, I I'm not certain I can really reliably pinpoint a favorite dish in any given region in the medieval period, the way you kind of can now, because the sources aren't framed in that light. Um, I I'm confident that probably there's a chronicle somewhere that says, well, and we Florentines do so love our blah blah blah. And the Lombards are known for loving their whatever, and the Swabians really love their this other thing. In fact, this cookbook, um, this Italian cookbook, uh, Registrim Coquine, I'll bring it back up. It's over here. Yeah, the third book there, Registrum Coquine. This one is actually, it's an Italian cookbook, but it presents a lot of very regional recipes. Like, it literally says this is a Swabian stew and this is an Alemane stew, and I mean it even uses like the old the old tribal names for these groups of barbarian hordes that swept across the Roman Empire. So that was really strange too. Pork soup for the Italics, veal for the Romans, pork for women, which is interesting that women need different pork. Beef for citizens, rustics, and peasants. Oh, my husband's over there laughing. He's such a child. Um, Meat pastellum for the Gauls and the Angles. Like the Angles. This is written in the 15th century. So why are they talking about the Angles? Um, but so there might, I can't say whether these are favorite dishes in those various regions, but at least there's some identification of specific dishes with specific regions, or at least dishes in a specific style. Um, but to be able, I couldn't reliably say, well, I mean, I can reliably say that boar is very common in Florence because they have a lot of wild boar everywhere. So boar is common. Whether it's a favorite dish is a different question. Um, I don't know if the source, probably the similar situation in Ireland, that the sources aren't necessarily clear enough to really say, well, this was definitely a favorite dish in medieval Ireland. I don't know. Can you
Yeah, it kind of does the
reliably
same
say
thing
that
where
sort
it
of thing?
assumes that Irish, unless you're dealing with the vision that we were talking about earlier, that's not really a vision. It's a lot of the time it does do it, but even on top of that, the vision itself, it does do, and it assumes that you know what the ingredients are. It assumes that when it says this specific line that they know what you're
Right,
talking about.
right,
But the problem is even at the time when they're writing this type of stuff, they're not writing it for us today. They didn't realize that a bunch of lunatics, what was it, 1,500 years later, would start trying to mimic and try to do what they're doing today. So when a lot of this
yeah,
is written down first, it's written for them, or written for them to remind them of a certain thing. You can see that even with the annals, where they literally have the
yeah. A lot
year
of
and then they have a reminder, but that's it. It wasn't there for you, it was for them, like.
yeah
And
for
now
them.
we're trying
Yeah,
to get the information out, extract as much as we can, and it's very, very difficult to do so. So yeah, even in Ireland you have the same problem popping up.
I mean, these medieval recipes are the same. They're clearly written for someone who knows what the dish is. So, for instance, I'll read you this recipe because that's how short it is. Goat tripe for the italics. Take goat tripe and pound it with a knife with hard-boiled eggs. Mix the tripe with chicken broth, adding saffron and other spices, and it will be good. The end. So there are so many holes in that recipe for someone who's never had this exact dish in this period, that, to begin to try to redact this, you have to make so many assumptions about quantities, about techniques, about how long you cook it, do you cook it, right? Um, it doesn't even talk about cooking it, actually. The word cook is never used. So, this recipe is written for someone who already knows the basics, who already understands the dish probably, and just knows basically what you need to do. So it's the same thing. These aren't written for modern people who are completely divorced from this time and place. It's written for contemporaries who basically know what they're talking about, which is annoying for us, the modern people.
It's crazy because you can even see that within what was it, martial art textbooks and stuff. In martial art textbooks written around the even all the way up to the 20th century, they assume that you would know basic wrestling. So when they're teaching more of the advanced movements and stuff, they will assume that you know a basic takedown, how to take someone off, do the nice little sweep of the legs. Most people don't know how to do a sweep of the legs. So when you're picking up these manuals and
No.
stuff, we have no clue what these people are talking about, and yet we're supposed to now get all these advanced movements and put it into the basic wrestling, which can be quite difficult at times, especially when we don't know what their interpretation of basic wrestling is. We know what Olympic wrestling is these days, but when it comes down to the basics of wrestling, a lot of people, especially if you're dealing with the likes of karate, for example, we don't know what their interpretation of basic wrestling is. And it's the same thing in Ireland as well, where we have an idea of what is it called, collar and wrist wrestling. Rambling Kern will probably come in here in a second and correct me on this one, but we have an idea of collar and elbow wrestling, but we don't know specifically how they would have wrestled back in the medieval period and stuff. So when it comes down to more of the advanced movements and stuff, it's like, a lot of guesswork going in there, like.
Right. Yeah, I think this is history in general, actually. I think people who don't study history from primary sources probably don't understand just how many holes there are that we have to figure out a way to fill in. And that's why the field of history is ongoing, right? History is not set in stone. I may learn something tomorrow by reading a newly discovered manuscript that's going to make me toss everything I've said today out the window.
Yeah. The comment section is right there. Catches Catch Can. Yeah, there's a link there between Catch Can wrestling in because that's the English version, if I'm not mistaken, and then the Irish version then was collar and elbow wrestling. And we have an idea of how it evolved, but then trying to trace it back down to the medieval period and stuff and how they wrestled back then can be quite difficult at times. But even in Iceland and stuff, there's interpretations and stuff going on there. So it's the same thing with trying to understand the basics to food cooking.
Right, exactly. Sorry, my husband is leaving. Wait, where are you going?
Just running out the door.
Oh, okay. He's packing up. It's just 9:40 in the morning on Sunday, so it's really weird to be going anywhere. It's also frigidly cold here. Um, yeah, shin kicking. Oh, that's fun. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's funny. I hate so folk martial arts. So I'm going to briefly address the topic of folk. So people assume that because something is a folk art, that it's been around forever in the form that it is now, and that's just not always true. In fact, it's rarely true, especially with folk music and folk dance. Because those things are passed down person to person, they morph very quickly from one person to the next person. There's lots of changes over time. People add their own flavors. So I would hesitate to say that a folk martial art tradition reflects anything someone was doing in the 15th century. Same thing as I would absolutely say folk dances don't have anything to do with medieval dances, for instance. So
Yeah.
that's my that's my historian's take on folk as
Yeah.
a reliability for a historical tradition.
Yeah, we kind of do the same thing over in Mallow in Ireland, where I'm from as well, where we assume a lot of the dancing that went place in Mallow would have been the exact same dancing that would have happened thousands of years, not realizing there's actually development. So even the dances that happen, oh God, I can't remember the name of the festival. There's a festival that's in Mallow, consists of dancing, and we assume it's the same kind of dancing that's been happening for the last thousands of years, when in fact it would
It
have
isn't.
changed, especially when you have that Norman influence that comes in and really changes the dancing in that entire area.
Well,
So yeah.
not just that, but people forget that clothing influences dance.
Yes.
And in the modern world, we have such free clothing, but clothing clothing and dance evolution go hand in hand. So you have a dance that's popular, then the clothes change, then a new dance forms to adapt to the new clothing. then the clothing changes, then a new dance form. So, the kind of dances you can do now, even folk dances, you couldn't do in 15th century clothes or ancient clothes because your clothes would have probably fallen off or tripped you.
Yes.
So
Especially with
it's
the Irish
yeah,
dancing.
yeah, exactly. And Irish dancing, modern folk Irish dancing is very heavily influenced by 18th and 19th century
Yeah.
dance forms that, and people are going to hate me when I say this, but came from England.
Yeah, but even
Um,
the influences from the Normans would have massively influenced what kind of Irish dancing was going on and stuff. And God, we're now going into the argument of Irish music and stuff, which is an argument all into itself. Like,
well,
so
yeah, the lack of knowledge of actual evidence there from, before the 18th century makes Irish music a particularly challenging topic.
massive arguments,
Um,
huge
yeah,
arguments.
massive, massive,
um,
massive.
so
Which
we can.
means we're going to have to do a music and dance session at some
Oh,
point.
oh God, opening up the can of worms.
Okay, well, we're going on 3 hours now, so I
Yeah,
feel like
we
we should
start
open
tidying
up
up from
maybe
there.
to any last questions that anyone has. Um,
Uh,
food related.
I think that's us tidying up there.
Yeah, let's
We'll
see.
give that a few seconds there. If anybody has sorry, if anyone has any last questions there, just drop it in the comment section very quickly as we just start to wrap it up. Um, Rachel, absolute pleasure having you on board today. Hopefully, our partners haven't ran completely. Hopefully, our partners come back after the all the historical mistakes I've made anyway today. But at least they were corrected and somewhat tidied up. Also, on top of that, if you haven't already jumped over to Rachel's channel, The Creative Contessa, click onto my page, scroll down to the bottom once we're done chatting away, click on Rachel's page and give her an old subscribe. If you're dealing with anything to do with 15th century clothing, Rachel is the first person to contact. God, there's so many channels, especially with AI now. Here, that's a discussion we need to have a chat
Oh
about. Is
God, yeah.
the AI art, which is spitting out the worst. It's grand when you're dealing with people who know what they're talking about, but the amount of people that are ignorant to medieval clothing, they're spitting out so much bad medieval. Oh my
Garbage.
God, it's absolutely horrendous. So Rachel has
Yeah.
her work cut out for her trying to fix all the mistakes that AI now is producing. Like there is no tomorrow. So in the future, over on Rachel's channel, we definitely have to do a video on AI art and watch
Oh God,
Rachel's
yeah.
disgusted. We'll just
Pick
torture
it
it, Rachel.
apart. Oh my God.
We're gonna torture Rachel for a good 2 hours over on her channel
Uh,
sometime. But if you're looking into actual historical accuracy, definitely go over to Rachel's channel and check it out. Thank you so much for holding my hand today and basically just running the whole channel today. Because your knowledge when it comes down to the fooding in 15th century and all around is absolutely magnificent. Thank you so much, Rachel, for that. If we've Thank you for the vlog. Oh yes, of course. I think we don't really have too many questions coming in to do with food, so I might just
yep.
wrap it up there. Um,
Yep.
Rachel, thank you.
Yep. Thank you for having me. And for those who don't know, my channel's The Creative Contessa, not Rachel.
Oh yeah, yeah. Sorry so much. The Creative Contessa. So definitely click on my
Yeah.
channel. Scroll down to the bottom. Go down to the Creative Contessa. Click on that one and click the old subscribe button. And make sure to ring the
Yeah.
bell button because for some reason now, since about 2 years ago, even if you subscribe, it will not pop up on the channel anymore. It's 100% algorithm ran, so it doesn't matter. It does not
Yep.
matter how many subscribers you have. You have to bum 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 all those videos out and constantly hit the top beats. So
Yep.
the only way you can get those those videos in is if you ring the bell button. So make sure you do that when you're
Right.
subscribing to your favorite channels. So definitely do that with myself, obviously, and Rachel over in the Creative Contessa. If nobody's got any more questions, I want to thank everybody that came in today. The feed
Yeah.
was so good.
It's
Running
great.
up with the thing today, so that was absolutely amazing. The amount of food questions we got in, and just the feed full stop was absolutely magnificent. Even when we were pausing for them few seconds to gather our thoughts, it was great to jump back into the comment section, work with you guys. So you guys were absolutely fantastic. And by the way, thank you for subscribing over to Rachel's channel as well, just there. Thanks so much, lads, and all the best. Slán go bhfuil ya.
I have